Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we slip quietly into a gallery of royal portraits, but not the triumphant, heroic kind. Instead, your lantern beam falls on the moments of clumsy endings, when crowns tilt awkwardly and fate strikes with the merciless humour of bad timing. Picture the great halls of Europe, the stone castles perched on stormy cliffs, the gold-leafed coronets glinting under candlelight, and then picture a monarch slipping on a staircase, or leaning too far out of a balcony to greet the crowd. You probably won't survive this little reminder that power does not protect you from ridiculous accidents, but at least you'll sleep with the comfort of knowing that even the mightiest were humbled by life's slapstick finale. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin in a chamber where marble busts stare down with stony serenity. But beneath those serene gazes lie stories of kings and queens whose ends were far from majestic. Misfortune is the theme, and you walk into it as if stepping onto a floor that's already slick with irony. Take King Alexander of Greece. No, not Alexander the Great, but his 20th century namesake, whose reign was short and whose end was laughably tragic. He didn't fall on a battlefield, didn't collapse under the weight of strategy or empire. Instead, while walking in the royal gardens in Athens in 1920, he tried to break up a fight between his beloved pet German shepherd and a mischievous monkey. In the scuffle, another monkey bit him. At first it seemed minor, a scratch, a bite, a royal shrug. But infection set in, septicemia followed, and within weeks the king was dead. A monarch felled not by war or conspiracy, but by a primate quarrel. Historians still argue whether his early death changed the fate of Greece, since it created a political vacuum that contributed to a national catastrophe in Asia Minor. But for you, half asleep, it's just the image of a king undone by a monkey bite, a detail that proves life's absurd humour spares no throne. Move further back in time, and you find Edmund Ironside of England. His death in 1016 carries a whiff of dark comedy. The chronicles whisper that he was assassinated on the Privy. Yes, stabbed while relieving himself in the most undignified setting imaginable. Imagine the hushed halls of power, the clash of armies, the drama of Viking invasions, all reduced to the image of a king slumped forward in the shadows of a medieval toilet. Some historians debate the accuracy. Was he stabbed in the rear? Did he simply die of wounds already sustained in battle? No one is certain. What remains is the enduring embarrassment. A ruler remembered not for victory, but for the comic cruelty of being ambushed at his most vulnerable moment. And then there's Charles VIII of France, the young monarch whose reign ended with a bump on the head. In 1498, he walked through a dim corridor in his castle at Amboise, preparing to watch a tennis match. The doorway was low, his stride confident, and his attention perhaps elsewhere. He struck his head on the stone lintel, stumbled, and hours later died of the injury. The chroniclers recorded it with sorrow, but you can almost hear the muffled giggles centuries later. The King of France, ruler of millions, defeated by bad architecture. The irony lingers, especially since Charles was obsessed with Italy and warfare, dreaming of conquest. Yet his doom came from nothing more than a badly designed doorway. Not to be outdone, you pause with Emperor Jovian of Rome, a man who reigned for only 8 months in the 4th century. Some accounts say he died of accidental carbon monoxide poisoning after sleeping in a room with a charcoal brazier burning too strongly. Others claim he simply overindulged in mushrooms or fish and keeled over. The point is, this was the man chosen to lead the empire after Julian the Apostate fell in battle, the man meant to restore order. Instead, his death reads like a cautionary tale about poor ventilation and questionable snacks. You can almost imagine him pulling a blanket tighter around himself, the smoke swirling, the imperial eagle standard standing silent outside the tent, while inside the emperor drifts away like any common soldier who forgot to crack open a window. You wander into another scene, this time in Scotland, where James II met his end not in battle but in spectacle. In 1460 he stood at Roxburgh Castle, eager to show off a new weapon, a massive cannon called the Lion. Cannons were the marvel of the age, symbols of progress and intimidation, but the great gun misfired, exploding at the breech, Shards tore through the king, killing him instantly in front of his men, a monarch obliterated not by enemy arrows, but by his own cutting-edge technology. The lesson? Even kings who believe they control the march of progress can end up as victims of premature innovation. Soldiers whispered prayers, nobles wept, but somewhere in the background, a jester might have shaken his head. The king killed by his own toy. You drift further, brushing against the tale of Sigurd the Mighty of Orkney, a Viking earl with ambitions as wide as the North Sea. He triumphed in battle against a Scottish noble, and in true warrior pride he strapped the severed head of his enemy to his saddle as a trophy. But as he rode, the head's teeth scratched his leg. The wound festered, infection set in, and soon Sigurd was dead. A Viking earl, fierce in life, reduced to a punchline by a set of posthumous molars. Historians still argue whether the saga embellishes the story, but even if legend has polished the edges, the absurdity rings true. Sometimes the enemy gets the last laugh, even from beyond the grave. There's Emperor Fedor of Russia, who in 1584 reportedly died after tripping and striking his head while playing with children. A Tsar brought down not by palace intrigue or assassin's blade, but by the horseplay of a father too caught up in the moment. It's the kind of detail that makes you pause. Was this really the man entrusted with an empire's fate? Imagine the nobles waiting in the next room, court clerks drafting decrees, while in the chamber beyond their sovereign lay stunned on the floor, the laughter of children still echoing, a crown lying slightly askew beside him. You tread carefully near the shadow of Bela I of Hungary. In 1063, as he sat on his throne, the wooden platform beneath him collapsed. Whether through sabotage, poor carpentry, or sheer bad luck, the throne gave way, crushing him. A king literally brought down by the seat of his own power. Chroniclers note the political chaos that followed, but the image is unshakable. A throne, symbol of authority, becoming the agent of humiliation. You lean in and whisper to yourself, never trust furniture when destiny is involved. And then, slipping like a shadow, comes the memory of Adolf Fredrik of Sweden, remembered forever as the king who ate himself to death. On a winter's evening in 1771, after a gargantuan meal of lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, champagne, and 14 servings of his favourite dessert, semler buns with hot milk, he collapsed. Though technically gluttony rather than an accident, the embarrassment endures. A king whose legacy is not policy but indigestion. Students of history may recall him only for that final feast, a tragicomic reminder that indulgence can crown itself with calamity. All these figures strewn across centuries bind together into a single thread. The crown may glitter, the halls may echo with ceremony, but misfortune stalks even the mightiest, with the same slapstick cruelty it reserves for commoners. You shuffle through these scenes, the laughter of fate muffled by velvet drapes. You notice how every one of these tales carries both historical weight and comic undertone. The monkey bite that shifted Greek politics, the shattered cannon that changed a Scottish campaign, the throne collapse that opened a succession crisis. Behind the comedy lies consequence, and behind consequence lies the reminder. Even accidents shape empires, and still, as you drift, you catch the gentle absurdity. An emperor felled by smoke, a Viking slain by teeth, a French king humbled by architecture. You chuckle softly, then yawn, realizing that tonight's journey is less about laughing at the dead, and more about easing into the awareness that even the highest crowns sit precariously. You probably won't die from a collapsing throne or an exploding cannon, but life's tiny misfortunes are enough to remind you. Dignity is fragile, even for kings. The glow of torches flickers over long wooden tables, silver goblets catch the light, and platters heavy with roasted meats and sugared delicacies steam in the draughty halls. You can almost hear the clatter of knives against trenchers, the rustle of velvet sleeves brushing plates, the hum of lute players filling the background as monarchs and courtiers settle into their feasts. A royal banquet was supposed to be the height of elegance, a performance of abundance meant to remind the world that the ruler had more than enough. Yet again and again you find yourself leaning closer to discover that these spectacles of indulgence were the stage for some of the most embarrassing deaths in history. Kings and queens, undone not by daggers or plots but by their own dinner. You start with Henry I of England, son of William the Conqueror. He was a man who loved two things, authority and eels. Not just any eels, lampreys, a slippery, jawless fish that resembles a nightmare with the teeth. Against his physician's advice, Henry indulged in a heaping portion of lampreys in 1135. Within days he was dead, felled by what the chronicles politely call a surfeit of lampreys. Some scholars think he died of food poisoning, others that his ageing body simply couldn't handle the heavy dish. Either way, the result was the same, a monarch reduced to a punchline about overindulgence. You picture him in his hall, pushing the platter away with satisfaction, while the courtiers around him forced smiles and muttered about his legendary appetite. And then, somewhere outside the castle walls, peasants laughed that the king had eaten himself into his grave. You drift further, carried by the cloying smell of meat and spices, to Emperor Claudius of Rome. By some accounts, his death in 54 CE came after a plate of mushrooms, supposedly his favourite delicacy. The problem? His wife, Agrippina the Younger, may have ensured those mushrooms were laced with poison. Tacitus and Suetonius suggest he swallowed his Last Supper unaware, though later whispers insisted he realised too late and tried to vomit. The embarrassment here is double-edged. The emperor who once commanded Rome toppled by an everyday fungus, and the man who prided himself on cleverness undone at his own table. Historians still argue whether it was natural illness or deliberate poisoning, but the scene lingers. The powerful emperor, face-flushed, servants panicking, the food of the gods turned into the food of his undoing. Not to be outdone, you stop at the banquet of Charles II of Navarre, known as Charles the Bad. His very nickname warns you things won't end well. In 1387, the king fell ill and was wrapped in brandy-soaked cloth as a medical treatment, a practice believed to soothe the body. But when a careless servant brought a candle too close, the cloth caught fire. Charles burned to death, flailing on his bed like a torch, a monarch literally roasted by his own curative ritual. You imagine the horrified attendants, the smell of burning fabric, the whispered prayers as they tried to smother the flames. A medical misstep turned into the most humiliating end possible. It was not just death by treatment. It was death by dinner's condiment, the same brandy once poured into his goblet now serving as his pyre. You wander toward the memory of Adolf Frederick of Sweden again, the king we last saw gorging himself into history. His death belongs squarely to this banquet hall collection. Lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, champagne, and semler buns swimming in hot milk, an obscene parade of indulgence. His people, weary of taxation, whispered bitterly about their parliamentary king, who died as he lived, soft and overfed. And yet, in the candlelit retelling, you can almost chuckle at the image of a monarch's final sigh echoing over a half-empty bowl of dessert. Even today, Swedes sometimes call semler the king's buns, a nickname that turns his excess into a legacy of laughter. Next, your lantern hovers over the tragic figure of George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, brother to Edward IV of England. He didn't die at a banquet, but his demise was forever tied to drink. After being convicted of treason in 1478, legend claims he chose to be executed by drowning in a butt of Malmsey wine. Historians debate if this was true or a later embellishment, but the imagery is too deliciously embarrassing to ignore. A royal duke, headfirst in a cask, the ultimate toast gone wrong. Whether he demanded it out of irony, or it was a cruel jest forced upon him, the story stuck. His contemporaries smirked, and centuries later you still can't shake the vision of a man whose epitaph might as well read, "Died of too much wine," literally. You move further east to the Ottoman court, where Sultan Selim II, nicknamed Selim the Sot, met his end in 1574 after slipping and hitting his head, while drunk after a feast. Known for his heavy drinking despite religious prohibitions, Selim was remembered less for his policies than for his love of wine and women. On that fateful day, staggering through the palace baths after indulging at the banquet table, he fell and suffered fatal injuries. A sultan, commander of armies and patron of Istanbul's greatest architecture, brought down by an unsteady step and a clouded head. The irony is hard to miss. An empire's leader undone not by rebellion, but by the last glass of wine he should have refused. The medieval courts are littered with stories of nobles and royals choking mid-feast. You recall the tale of Martin of Aragon, who in 1410 reportedly died after a combination of indigestion from an entire goose and laughter at a crude joke. Imagine it! The king, belly-stuffed, roaring with mirth at his jester, only to collapse with a final wheeze. Some chronicles say he choked, others that his body simply gave out under the strain. Either way, the embarrassment is complete. Sovereign dignity smothered beneath goose grease and laughter. And then there's the story of Bella IV of Hungary's daughter, Elizabeth. At a banquet in 1270, she supposedly choked to death on fish bones. Though not a ruling monarch herself, her royal blood made her fate the stuff of hushed whispers in the candlelight. A court gathering turned sombre as servants tried and failed to save her, and yet, centuries later, her death survives not as a tragedy of statecraft, but as a cautionary tale. Chew carefully, even if you're royal. Another scene unfolds with Louis III of France, who technically did not choke, but met an equally humiliating end tied to desire. In 882, he spotted a beautiful maiden from his window, rushed to pursue her, and banged his head on the lintel of the doorway. He lingered for days before dying. The banquet hall connection? Chroniclers recorded that he'd been drinking and dining before his reckless pursuit. Imagine the laughter of courtiers retelling the tale. A king undone not by war, but by lust, appetite, and poor judgment in architecture. Even outside Europe, the banquet curse lingers. Chinese dynastic histories tell of emperors felled by overindulgence. Zhu Qizhen of the Ming dynasty, for example, nearly died of gluttony multiple times, though he lived longer than expected. His court physicians often scolded him, noting that his constant feasting brought him to the brink. You realise that across cultures, the embarrassment of rulers undone by their own excess repeats like a chorus. Historians still argue whether these reports were exaggerated moral tales, crafted by court scribes to warn of future emperors against greed, but the pattern is undeniable. As you lean back, you notice a thread binding these stories together. Banquets were supposed to showcase abundance, yet they became traps. The king who ignored medical warnings and devoured lampreys, the emperor who trusted mushrooms, the sultan who drank one goblet too many, the monarch who laughed too hard after too much goose. Every feast was a stage for both majesty and downfall, the glittering silverware reflecting not just power, but human frailty. You drift past the long tables one last time, your fingers trailing over goblets and trenchers. Somewhere in the air you hear a joke, a cough, a hiccup, the sound of a chair scraping back in alarm. The lesson settles over you like a warm blanket. Indulgence is the great equalizer. You may not dine on lampreys or drown in wine, but even you know the embarrassment of overindulgence. And now, half asleep, you smile at the absurd thought that history's grandest figures spent their last moments just as awkwardly as anyone caught with a hiccup at the dinner table. The echo of footsteps on stone stairways, the creak of saddles under armoured weight, the dizzying drop from castle balconies, these are the sounds that trail you now. You've left behind banquet halls with their clinking goblets and wandered into corridors, battlements, and high perches where kings and queens thought themselves untouchable. And yet, as you steady your imagination against the railing, you realise how often gravity had the last laugh. Monarchs, for all their crowns and jewels, still fell, literally, and their deaths became stories that blended sorrow with slapstick. Tonight you walk those perilous edges with them. The first shadow that rises is Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, the red-bearded titan of the Holy Roman Empire. In 1190 he set out on the Third Crusade, leading thousands across treacherous lands. His followers saw him as a figure almost beyond mortality. But at the Salif River in modern-day Turkey, he attempted to cross on horseback. The emperor slipped into the current, weighed down by armour and drowned. Some say he suffered a heart attack first, others that the horse stumbled, but the humiliation was the same. The great emperor swallowed by a stream so modest, his soldiers could hardly believe it. Historians still argue whether his death was by misjudgment or cruel chance. But you can see the irony. Armoured might undone by a splash. His army dissolved soon after, leaving the crusade weakened. A simple fall changed the course of continents. You tiptoe into England now, where William II, known as William Rufus, met his end in 1100. He was out hunting in the New Forest, that same wilderness where his father William the Conqueror had seized land with ruthless efficiency. A stray arrow, loosed by one of his men, struck him down, but whispers soon spread. Was it an accident or a deliberate act? Either way, the embarrassment lay in the setting. A king whose reign had been turbulent, marked by rebellion and quarrels with the church, perished not in glorious battle but sprawled on the forest floor, felled like the very deer he had come to hunt. Imagine the hush among the hunting party, the nervous glances, the body lying awkwardly among the bracken. His crown had not shielded him from the randomness of misaimed archery. In the icy north, you stumble upon Hakon the Sixth of Norway. In 1380 he died after falling ill, but local sagas also murmur about accidents while travelling by sea. The Norse world was filled with risks of slipping, tumbling and drowning. Even the skalds who preferred to cast kings in heroic verse could not disguise the vulnerability of rulers slipping on deck or toppling overboard. You imagine the salt spray, the deck slick underfoot, the crown sliding dangerously as the monarch tried to steady himself against the mast. For every heroic saga there lingered the possibility of a far less dignified stumble. Closer to the Renaissance you encounter Francis II of France, husband to Mary, Queen of Scots. He died at just 16, not in a duel or rebellion, but after complications from an ear infection. Yet the imagery of his weakness, sometimes described as fainting or collapsing during courtly movement, left contemporaries smirking. A boy king, too fragile even to keep his balance. The official line was illness, but the whispers painted a picture of a monarch whose body betrayed him in public. The embarrassment wasn't the ear itself. It was the image of a king unable to remain upright during ceremonies meant to project majesty. More dramatic is the story of John I of Castile. In 1390, while preparing for war, he mounted his horse in Alcalá de Henares. Something startled the animal. It bolted, threw him against a branch, and he died instantly. Here was a king who dreamed of glorious campaigns, who wielded banners and knights, yet who perished by a tree limb and an uncooperative horse. You can picture his entourage galloping to his side, the stunned silence as they realised that an entire dynasty's fate had shifted in seconds. The chronicles recorded his death in hushed tones, but underneath, you can hear the soft laughter of irony, a monarch reduced to an accident that could happen to any careless rider. Even more absurd is the tale of Emperor John II Komnenos of Byzantium. In 1143, while hunting wild boar, he accidentally pricked himself with a poisoned arrow from his own quiver. A stumble, a slip, and suddenly the mighty ruler of Byzantium was fatally wounded by his own equipment. Historians note that he was admired for his piety and competence, making his ignoble death all the more startling. Imagine the hush among his soldiers as they carried him back, knowing that a tiny slip of the hand had undone a man who had steered the empire for decades. And then there is Ladislaus IV of Hungary, known as the Cuman. In 1290, while resting in his tent, he was ambushed and killed by rebellious Cumans, the very people with whom he had often allied. Chronicles describe his reign as chaotic, but his end was humiliating. Not on a battlefield, but sprawled on the ground, dragged from his own bedroll. The imagery is one of a man who misjudged his alliances, who thought himself safe, only to be toppled by those closest. It wasn't technically a fall from a great height, but it was a symbolic collapse, from the illusion of control straight into betrayal's arms. The corridors of history also carry the echo of Margaret, Countess of Tyrol, who reportedly fell from her horse during travel. Nobility often rode with pomp, expecting peasants to marvel at their procession, yet a single stumble could turn grandeur into tragedy. Cloaks snagged, saddles slipped, reins tangled. These were the equalizers. Picture a royal cloak billowing impressively one moment, then catching on a stirrup the next, dragging its wearer into the mud. That is the true texture of falling from glory. One cannot overlook Baldwin V of Jerusalem, the child king who died in 1186. Weak from illness, stories paint him as a boy who could hardly walk without stumbling. His reign was brief, and though his death came from disease, his frequent fainting and falls at court became symbolic of a fragile kingdom teetering toward collapse. When you read of him now, you see not just a child sovereign, but an image of the entire Crusader state, leaning precariously like a boy about to fall. Of course, one of the most legendary royal accidents belongs to Emperor Maximilian of Mexico, though his death came by execution, not fall. Yet before that grim moment, he was often mocked for clumsy appearances, slipping in speeches, fainting in heat, or nearly tumbling from balconies. His enemies used these moments as propaganda, painting him as unfit. The line between literal fall and symbolic collapse blurred. Historians still argue whether these tales were exaggerated, but the fact remains, the power of a stumble could undo even the image of empire. As you trail your fingers along the cold stone of stairwells, you begin to notice a pattern. Gravity was never biased. It didn't care if you wore ermine-trimmed robes or a simple tunic. Monarchs, for all their ceremony, lived surrounded by physical risks: high towers, swift horses, heavy armour, slick marble, precarious balconies. The higher the throne, the greater the drop, and you smile, half amused, half lulled, at the thought that even you, walking through your modern life, have stumbled on curbs, tripped over shoelaces, or misjudged a step in the dark. If it could embarrass a king into history, surely your own stumbles are nothing to worry about. Tonight, the lesson is soft and wry. Everyone falls, but not everyone falls into chronicles. Monarch simply had the bad luck of an audience. Steam curls against arched ceilings, droplets bead across polished tiles, and the scent of herbs and oils hovers heavy in the air. You step into a royal bathhouse, a place where marble benches gleam and fountains murmur, where emperors, kings, and queens sought not war or counsel, but the illusion of ease. Yet beneath the languid surface, danger lingers. Slippery stone, overheated rooms, careless attendants. Tonight you glide quietly through those misty chambers to witness how indulgence in relaxation sometimes led to the most humiliating ends. The first vision that rises through the steam is Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, a man whose intellect and curiosity fascinated Europe. He surrounded himself with scholars, falcons, and philosophers, and he was rumoured to indulge in lavish baths scented with rose oil. Though Frederick did not officially die in his bath, chroniclers noted his obsession with bathing rituals as a potential contributor to illness. In the medieval imagination, warm baths opened the body to corrupt heirs. The irony? A man celebrated for reason may have hastened his decline through the very comfort he craved. You imagine him reclining against marble, steam swirling around, servants pouring perfumed water, while unseen microbes plotted their victory. More dramatic is the story of Elagabalus, the Roman emperor infamous for extravagance. He filled baths with saffron and rose petals, his decadence earning whispers of ridicule even in a city used to excess. Some tales claim that he nearly drowned in his own perfumed pools, the oils making the floor slick, attendants panicking as he slid beneath the water. His assassination in 222 CE overshadowed any bathing mishap, but the story stuck, because even in memory, his baths became symbols of embarrassing vulnerability. Historians still argue how much is scandal and how much is truth, yet the lingering image is vivid, an emperor nearly undone by the luxury of his tub. Then comes the tale of Charles III of Spain. By the 18th century, hydrotherapy had become fashionable, and Charles was no stranger to mineral baths. Rumour whispers that his health collapsed after a series of such treatments. The embarrassment lay not only in death, but in the ridicule of a king undone by fashionable cures. Imagine him eased into steaming pools by attendants, his body frail, courtiers muttering about the irony of a monarch drowning slowly in prescriptions of comfort rather than in the clash of history. But the most famous bathhouse blunder belongs to Seleucus II Callinicus of the Seleucid Empire. In 225 BCE, he reportedly died after falling from his horse. Yes, but only after slipping while trying to recover from illness in heated baths. The overlap between healing and harm is sharp. The very place meant to restore became the threshold of death. Chroniclers depict him as weak, his body failing, courtiers whispering at how unbecoming it was for a king to collapse in the water rather than on a battlefield. Perhaps the most tragicomic image arrives from the Ottoman Empire, with Sultan Ibrahim I, remembered by history with the cruel nickname Ibrahim the Mad. He delighted in luxuries, including elaborate bath rituals with concubines and musicians. Chroniclers describe him spending hours in the hammam, the air dense with steam. Though he was eventually executed, rumours suggest that fainting fits in the bathhouse embarrassed him long before his fall from the throne. You picture him sprawled on hot tiles, attendants rushing with fans and towels, the laughter of fate echoing through steam-clouded air. Closer to Russia, you encounter Tsar Peter III, husband of Catherine the Great. Accounts of his demise vary, but some versions whisper of his foolish slips in bathhouses, of drunken stumbles near steaming tubs. Though he was strangled in 1762, the stories of his clumsy leisure time spread gleefully among courtiers who mocked his lack of regal presence. Death in the bath was not his literal fate, yet his reputation drowned there long before his murder. You can't leave without pausing by the Roman poet Ovid's account of Crispus, son of Constantine the Great. Crispus met his end in 326 CE, executed under murky circumstances, but some later embellishments placed him in steamy chambers, poisoned or suffocated in the vapours of a bath. The embarrassment here was less about the accident than about the gossip. Even centuries later, people couldn't resist imagining royal demise against the backdrop of steam and soap. One of the most chilling bathhouse tales comes from Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia. Known for his love of comfort, he spent long stretches of time in bathhouses while his kingdom simmered with unrest. In 1419, rebels stormed Prague, and though he wasn't killed in his tub, the chroniclers mocked him for languishing in baths while politics boiled outside. His death from a stroke shortly after one such retreat gave fuel to ridicule, the king who soaked while his throne slipped away. You tread further into eastern courts, where Chinese chronicles speak of Emperor Xiaozong of the Ming dynasty, who nearly drowned in a bath after fainting. Though attendants saved him, the scandal remained, and later rumours exaggerated his frailty. For rulers expected to embody dragon-like strength, to collapse naked and helpless in a bath was the ultimate humiliation. Scholars still argue whether the story was slander spread by rivals, but the whisper persists like steam that refuses to clear. In the Persian tradition, Shah Abbas II reportedly overindulged in hammam rituals, fainting in overheated rooms. Whether from drink, exhaustion, or illness, his collapse in steam symbolised excess. The Shah, whose armies had marched with vigour, was reduced to a limp body carried from the baths, whispers echoing louder than drums. And you can't forget the French monarch Louis II, known as Louis the Stammerer. Though his 879th death was attributed to illness, courtly gossip tied his weakness to endless hot baths and indulgent relaxations. Even in France, where elegance excused many eccentricities, to be remembered as a man too fond of soaking left an indelible mark of embarrassment. Bathhouses were dangerous not only for slips and fainting, but also for politics. Assassins loved them. A monarch in steam was a monarch disarmed, naked, and blinded by mist. It is said that Byzantine courtiers whispered of emperors strangled in the hammam, though evidence is scant. Still, the trope took hold. The ruler's vulnerability laid bare among tiles and towels. And isn't that what embarrasses most in these stories? Not the death itself, but the sheer exposure. Armour, robes, crowns, all stripped away. The king or queen left human, skin beaded with sweat, slipping like anyone else on wet stone. You drift through the steam and hear the splashes of attendants, the rush of water over marble, the hushed panic when a body slides limp beneath the surface. Remember how Charles VIII died from a doorway bump? The bathhouse is its wetter cousin. Architecture, heat, and human clumsiness conspiring together. You imagine that in each of these cases someone tried to preserve dignity, wrapping towels quickly, whispering prayers, keeping the truth quiet. Yet history loves to exaggerate the ridiculous, and so kings who slipped, fainted, or drowned in comfort became bedtime cautionary tales. As you leave the mist, your own skin feels warm, your breath slow. You realise the lesson is not about death, but about vulnerability. No matter how high the crown, no one is safe from the betrayal of slippery tiles. You let the steam fade into night air, smiling at the irony that the most private of royal indulgences became their most public humiliation. The horn sounds in the early morning, echoing through forests of oak and pine. Horses snort clouds of steam into the chill air, dogs strain at leashes, and the ground trembles under hooves. The hunt was more than leisure. It was a royal performance, a spectacle meant to show vigour, mastery, and dominance over nature. Yet again and again, as you step softly into the undergrowth of memory, you find that the hunt was as dangerous as any battlefield. Kings and emperors set out to kill stags or boars, only to find themselves pierced, crushed, or trampled. You push branches aside, and suddenly you are there, in the clearings where royal pride toppled into humiliation. Your first stop is the tale of Philip the Fair, King of France. In 1314, he was injured badly during a hunt. Some chronicles say by a fall from his horse, others by striking against a tree. He lingered for days before dying. his once imposing reputation tarnished by the absurdity of dying not at war but from crashing into bark. Historians still argue about the details, but the image remains. A monarch who had persecuted the Templars and wielded immense power, meeting his end with all the dignity of a riderless horse. From there, you wander to the forests of Scotland, where King Alexander III met his fate in 1286. After a council meeting, he insisted on riding home through storm and darkness. His horse lost its footing near the cliffs of Fife, and Alexander fell to his death. The king who had fought for stability and unity was undone by one reckless ride. His courtiers found his body the next morning, broken among the rocks. The embarrassment lingers not only in the fall, but in the stubbornness. An old king unwilling to wait for daylight, undone by his own impatience. Cross to the forests of Central Europe, and you find Wenceslaus III of Bohemia, slain during a campaign. While not strictly a hunting death, legends insisted he was distracted by the sport, wasting time in forests when enemies closed in. That image of a monarch who preferred chasing deer over preparing armies became a lasting stain on his reputation. The symbolic hunt can be as embarrassing as the literal one. Farther south, in Hungary, King Ladislaus V faced the humiliation of injury during hunts. Chroniclers often whispered that the king's weakness was exposed when he tumbled from horses or failed to master wild boar. He died young, but his image was haunted by rumours of clumsy leisure. Imagine courtiers watching him lunge with a spear, only to miss spectacularly. The king's blushes linger louder in memory than his decrees, but perhaps the most famous royal hunting mishap is that of William II of England, William Rufus. You already walked briefly through his story, struck by an arrow in the New Forest in 1100. Some say it was Walter Tyrrell's stray shot, others whisper it was deliberate. Regardless, the setting was damning. A king slain not in noble combat but among deer and brambles, his corpse abandoned as companions fled in panic. The embarrassment was amplified by irony. The New Forest itself had been carved from peasant land by his father, William the Conqueror, a brutal act. It seemed almost poetic justice that the forest took its revenge on the sun. And then there's the tale of Robert II of France. Known as Robert the Pious, his reign was long, but during his hunts he was mocked for clumsy accidents. Chroniclers note his repeated falls from horses and his tendency to injure himself. Though he did not die hunting, his reputation carried the scent of humiliation each time he entered the forest. You picture him returning to court bruised, while servants whispered and jesters smirked behind their hands. Sometimes a king's greatest enemy is not rival kingdoms, but his own horse. Further east, in Poland, King Augustus II the Strong provides another curious case. Famous for feats of strength, snapping horseshoes with his bare hands, breaking iron chains, he adored the chase. Yet in his later years, a fall during a hunt left him seriously injured, undermining his reputation as invincible. To a man who had cultivated the image of Hercules reborn, stumbling in the forest was mortifying. Historians note the contradiction. A sovereign capable of crushing silverware between his fingers, yet undone by a single misplaced hoofbeat. In Byzantium, Emperor Basil I died in 886 under the most humiliating circumstances. Out hunting, he was dragged by his horse after his belt caught on the saddle. The emperor was trampled, clawed by branches, and left fatally injured. Imagine the horror of attendants racing through the forest, finding their ruler battered and broken, not by enemy blades, but by a wardrobe malfunction. Historians still argue over whether the accident was embellished by rivals, but the lesson is the same. Power cannot protect you from being dragged through the mud. Even more grotesque is the fate of Charles VIII of France. Though his death was architectural rather than natural, his hunting escapades were equally notorious. Chroniclers recorded him stumbling during hunts, striking his head and being mocked. His final demise at Amboise, from a low doorway, echoed his pattern of clumsy missteps. The king who dreamed of Italian conquest couldn't even navigate his own castle without bruises. You pause at a darker tale, King Henry II of France, whose hunting accident in 1559 remains infamous. At a jousting tournament, essentially hunting in armour, he faced Gabriel Montgomery. A lance splinter pierced Henry's eye and brain. He lingered in agony for days before dying. Catherine de' Medici wept publicly, but many whispered that she had long feared the dangers of Henry's reckless tournaments. This was a king undone not by war but by the sport he loved, in full public view. The embarrassment spread across Europe, for what was meant to be a display of martial splendour became a grotesque spectacle of royal fragility. From Persia, you catch the scent of lions and leopards. Monarchs there often demonstrated bravery by hunting beasts. Shah Ismail II of the Safavid dynasty nearly met his end when a lion lunged too quickly. Though he survived, the story of him scrambling to safety clung to his reputation. To falter, even briefly, against prey was humiliating. Every courtier remembered the moment long after his decrees faded. And then there is Philip of Swabia, King of Germany. He adored the hunt, yet one slip from his horse nearly ended him prematurely. Chroniclers loved to note these mishaps, exaggerating the king's embarrassment to remind readers that even sovereigns tumble. Though Philip's actual death came later at the hands of an assassin, his image as a clumsy rider haunted him, an emperor mocked for being unable to stay mounted. In the forests of Central Asia, Mongol Khans often proved their worth through grand hunts called nerj. Some died during these exhausting pursuits, trampled by horses or collapsing from exhaustion. Though not always named individually, the chronicles hint at the embarrassment. Khans who claimed descent from the heavens reduced to coughing in dust while chasing antelope. The symbolic fall mattered as much as the literal one. The hunting grounds of Europe are haunted by countless such echoes. Nobles toppled from saddles, pierced by their own spears, or crushed beneath deer they failed to bring down. Dogs yelped, courtiers gasped, horns went silent, and each time the lesson was whispered anew. Pride and spectacle are flimsy shields against clumsy fate. As you step back from the forest edge, the imagery lingers. Hooves pounding, arrows whistling, laughter turning to shrieks. You notice the strange rhythm. Monarchs sought to prove mastery over beasts, but often it was the beasts or the saddle or the tree that won. You smile in the dim light, comforted by the thought that even the highest thrones cannot conquer chance. Everyone falls, some in banquet halls, some in bathhouses, and here, under branches where dignity is as fragile as a snapped twig. The banquet halls have quieted, the hunting horns have gone silent, and now you slip into the chambers where velvet curtains hang heavy, where candelabras glow softly, and where rulers believe themselves safest. The royal bedchamber, a sanctum of privacy, intimacy, and supposed security. Yet again and again, you discover that sovereigns did not always drift gently into sleep. Instead, some died in circumstances that stripped away dignity, leaving behind whispers of embarrassment that echo louder than their reigns. Tonight, you tread lightly across creaking floorboards, past carved headboards and embroidered pillows, to see how kings and queens met their most humiliating ends beneath the canopy. The first shadow you meet is George II of Great Britain. In 1760, he rose early at Kensington Palace, complaining of chest pains, and while attempting his morning routine in the water closet, he collapsed dead. Technically not quite in bed, but close enough to be remembered as the king who died on the toilet. The chronicles soften it by saying he died suddenly, but later gossip made the story sharper, mocking the monarch's dignity. Imagine servants rushing in, finding their sovereign sprawled in nightclothes, crownless, his final moment unceremonious. Historians still debate whether it was an aortic aneurysm or stroke, but the memory remains. George II, the monarch who slipped quietly from power in the most private of spaces. Not far from him in the annals is King Frederick William I of Prussia, who prided himself on discipline and order. Yet in 1740, after years of gout and illness, he died confined to his bed, swollen and unable to rise. His soldiers admired him as the soldier king, but the whispers of his final months were of a ruler trapped in sheets, groaning and helpless. The embarrassment came not from accident, but from the mismatch between image and reality. A stern warrior reduced to a bedridden invalid, his royal bedroom smelling more of medicine than of majesty. You move softly now into France, where King Charles VIII, yes, the same one who cracked his skull on a doorway, also suffered from humiliating bedroom rumours. After his fatal accident in 1498, attendants carried him to his chamber. He lingered only a few hours before dying on a mattress, blood trickling. Courtiers whispered about how awkward it was, the king's body convulsing in full view of attendants who should never have seen him so exposed. The French court was obsessed with dignity, and yet their monarch's final breaths were accompanied by panicked chamberlains wringing hands beside the bed. Then comes Philip I of Castile, better known as Philip the Handsome. His beauty was legendary, but in 1506 he died young, after what some chroniclers called a fever and others blamed on poisoned water. Gossip suggested he collapsed in bed after reckless drinking and womanizing. The humiliation lies in the contrast, a man celebrated for his appearance ending as a sweating, gasping figure, unable to rise from tangled sheets. His wife, Juana of Castile, famously refused to part with his body, trailing it across Spain in grief. The king's last hours in bed were thus overshadowed by a legacy of rumours and ridicule. You slip across the Channel to England again, to Edward II. His death in 1327 remains one of the most debated and most scandalous. Officially he died in captivity at Berkeley Castle, but rumours spread that his enemies killed him in bed by a grotesque method involving a red-hot poker. Historians still argue whether this was propaganda, invented to smear his memory, but the tale stuck. Imagine the whispers, a disgraced king, stripped of dignity, writhing in the sheets under unimaginable pain. Even if apocryphal, the story lingers precisely because it captures the ultimate humiliation. Death not only in confinement, but in the very chamber where a monarch should feel safest. Shift east to Russia, where Tsar Ivan VI, a forgotten boy emperor, spent most of his life imprisoned. In 1764, when guards attempted to free him during a coup, others rushed in and killed him in his cell. He was stabbed, falling on his bedding, his royal lineage erased in a chamber without ceremony. The humiliation. That he died not in a palace, but in a bed that looked more like a prison cot, unknown to his people until long after. Then you pass into the chamber of Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia, who famously drowned at Mohács in 1526. But the embarrassing rumour whispered at court was that he often collapsed in bed from indulgence, his body weak long before the battle. Chroniclers painted him as a king too soft, too fond of sheets and cushions. His actual death came in water, but his bedroom reputation meant that even in memory he seemed a monarch who could not stand tall. Further north, you glimpse Eric XIV of Sweden. He died in 1577 after being poisoned, likely with arsenic, while imprisoned. The detail that embarrassed many was that he consumed the poison in a bowl of pea soup served to him in his chamber. A king reduced to eating prison fare, dying in bed after soup, his once grand title fading under ridicule. The whispers of courtiers turned him into a cautionary tale. No matter how high you rise, you can still end sprawled in sheets after a humble supper. You turn next to Portugal, where King Sebastian vanished in battle in 1578, but his uncle, King Henry of Portugal, provides a bedroom embarrassment. In 1580 he died in his chamber, childless, his body riddled with illness. The rumours painted his final weeks as pathetic. Attendants forced to spoon broth to him, courtiers mocking that the kingdom's future ended in a sick room. His dynasty's collapse became tied forever to that quiet chamber. Another dim-lit room opens before you, and here lies King James V of Scotland. After his army's defeat at Solway Moss in 1542, James retreated to his bed at Falkland Palace. He collapsed into despair, refusing food, and within days was dead. His courtiers remembered him muttering about weakness, his head sinking into pillows. A king whose father, James IV, had died gloriously in battle, James V's humiliation was that he wasted away sulking in bed. His final words, "It came with a lass, and it will pass with a lass," echoed irony, foretelling that the Stuart line would continue through his infant daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots. And what of Empress Anna of Russia? In 1740 she died after long illness, bedridden, her once formidable presence reduced to moans muffled in sheets. Chroniclers mocked her gluttony, linking her end to overindulgence. To see the ruler of such a vast empire waste away in her chamber was embarrassing in its contrast. Public majesty dissolving in private weakness. The bedroom also witnessed assassination. Consider Henry IV of Castile, mocked throughout his reign as weak. He died in 1474, supposedly from illness, but whispers insisted he'd been poisoned in his chamber. Servants found him in bed, pale and lifeless, and courtiers snickered about how Henry the Impotent died as he had lived, in weakness. Through all these chambers the theme is clear. The royal bed was supposed to be a sanctuary, but it often became the stage for indignity. Whether it was sudden collapse, poison, lingering weakness, or assassination, the bedchamber stripped away ceremony and left rulers looking like ordinary mortals. You linger at the edge of one more bed, that of Napoleon Bonaparte on St. Helena. Though not exactly embarrassing, there was something pitiable in the emperor who once ruled Europe dying on a narrow cot in exile. Curtains pulled to hide his wasted frame. He had dreamed of a golden bedchamber in Paris, but instead attendants recorded him vomiting, sweating and whispering regrets. Historians still argue whether it was stomach cancer or poison, but the setting, bedridden in obscurity, was the humiliation. And so, as you leave these chambers, you feel the weight of contrast. Thrones glittered, coronations shone, but the bedroom told the truth. Here, kings and queens collapsed like anyone else, tangled in sheets, robbed of ceremony. Their last breaths were not marked by trumpets, but by whispers and the creak of mattress boards. As you draw the canopy closed behind you, the lesson seeps in gently. Even the highest power dissolves into frailty at night. You roll onto your side, perhaps smiling at the irony, perhaps yawning at the familiarity. For in the end, the royal chamber was no safer than your own, and the embarrassment of kings becomes the comfort of mortals drifting into sleep. The trumpets blare, banners snap in the wind, and velvet-draped balconies spill over with cheering crowds. Pageantry was the language of kings and queens, the stage on which their grandeur could dazzle subjects into obedience. Coronations, weddings, jousts, processions, tournaments, all were carefully choreographed performances meant to proclaim power. But for every spectacle that glittered, there were others where spectacle turned spectacle's fool. Tonight, you stroll quietly through those parades and ceremonies, peeking behind the pomp to watch rulers undone by the very shows meant to glorify them. You first pause at Henry II of France, a monarch already encountered in the hunting field, but whose end was firmly anchored in pageantry. In 1559, Paris prepared a lavish tournament to celebrate a peace treaty and the marriage of Henry's daughter. The jousting lists were lined with silk canopies, nobles gleamed in armour, and the king himself rode out in splendour. But in one tilt against Gabriel Montgomery, a lance shattered, its splinters piercing Henry's eye and brain. The king, dressed for victory, collapsed in front of thousands. For days he lingered, his chamber a theatre of agony, until death claimed him. Historians note that Catherine de' Medici, his wife, had begged him not to joust, warning of omens. Yet Henry, too proud to be absent from his own show, rode anyway. Imagine the stunned silence of the crowd, the music dying mid-note, the realization spreading. Their sovereign lay twitching in the dust, victim of a sport meant to showcase his valour. From France you slip east to Byzantium, where emperors excelled in theatrical displays. The Hippodrome of Constantinople roared with chariot races, crowds chanting, colours waving. Yet history tells of emperors who stumbled in their role as masters of ceremony. Michael III, known as the Drunkard, reportedly appeared slovenly during public rituals, once falling from his horse in full view of the masses. Though not his death, the humiliation clung to him, making later chroniclers emphasise the irony of an emperor who could command legions but not his own balance. His eventual assassination was overshadowed by gossip of these clumsy displays. In England, Richard II's coronation in 1377 shimmered with gold and silk, but later processions revealed his weakness. Chroniclers recall him collapsing during ceremonies, his frail body unable to endure the weight of robes and crown. The ultimate embarrassment came when he was deposed, forced to abdicate publicly in 1399. Pageantry turned against him. The same pomp that once elevated him now underscored his downfall. Imagine him standing there stripped of regalia, while nobles smirked behind masks of solemnity. Historians still argue how much was his fault, and how much was propaganda. But the pageantry of loss burned into memory as much as any coronation. You drift into Spain now, to Charles II, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. His public appearances were meant to demonstrate royal health, yet each procession revealed the opposite. Pale, sickly, unable to walk without aid, Charles became a living embarrassment. Once, at a religious festival, he fainted mid-prayer before the crowd. Another time his robes tangled and he stumbled down steps in front of nobles. Chroniclers whispered of curses, of inbreeding, of divine punishment. The perils of pageantry here lay not in accident, but in cruel exposure, the king's frailty displayed like a lantern in darkness. But perhaps no death demonstrates pageantry's peril like that of Emperor Commodus of Rome. Though his official assassination came later in private, his reputation was destroyed in public spectacles. Commodus insisted on performing as a gladiator, parading himself in the arena before roaring crowds. Though he usually fought staged battles, the sight of an emperor stripped to the waist, wielding a wooden sword, made Romans laugh rather than cheer. He wanted to dazzle, but instead he humiliated himself. Imagine senators, jaws clenched, watching their emperor strut in sand, believing he was Hercules reborn, while the people muttered that Rome had fallen from dignity. His eventual strangling in bed was almost merciful compared to the public shame he had already endured. You step into the 17th century, where Louis XIV perfected pageantry at Versailles. Yet even the Sun King faced embarrassment. In 1686, during a public surgery to remove an anal fistula, courtiers crowded to watch. The operation was successful, but the idea that hundreds witnessed the king's most intimate humiliation lingers. It was meant as a performance of resilience, but it highlighted fragility. Historians still argue whether Louis truly chose to make it public, or whether sycophants turned his suffering into a spectacle. Either way, the spectacle of royal flesh sliced open in candlelight was unforgettable. Travelling north, you find Gustav III of Sweden, who adored theatre so much he built his own opera house. His court was one long pageant of costumes, music and masquerades. In 1792 he attended a masked ball, only to be shot by a disgruntled nobleman. The ball turned instantly from glittering entertainment to bloody chaos. Gustav lingered for weeks before dying, his end forever tied to the irony of a masquerade turned tragedy. The danger of pageantry was literal here, a king murdered in the very costume party he loved. Further east, you glimpse the coronation of Tsar Nicholas II in 1896, a ceremony designed to radiate imperial power. But tragedy struck at the Kodinka field, where a crowd of thousands gathered for free gifts. A stampede broke out, killing more than 1,000 people. Nicholas attended a ball later that night, trying to preserve appearances, but the public never forgave him. Though the Tsar did not die that day, his reputation did. The pageantry of his coronation became an omen of the empire's doom. Historians still argue whether he could have handled it differently, but the embarrassment clung. The emperor who celebrated while his subjects trampled one another. Even in smaller courts, spectacle carried danger. In Poland, King Sigismund II Augustus once staged a lavish wedding procession through Krakow. Chroniclers whispered that he fell from his horse mid-parade, his robes tangling. Though he survived, the laughter of crowds undercut the carefully staged display. A king was supposed to ride tall and flawless. Instead, he was red-faced and dusty, a reminder that even majesty can trip. Across the world in Japan, emperors were often shielded from public view, but shoguns staged elaborate processions. One tale tells of Tokugawa Iemochi fainting from heat in a summer parade, collapsing in front of samurai. Though attendants rushed to cover him, the embarrassment could not be erased. Pageantry demands perfection, and fainting mid-performance shatters the illusion. And then there is Pope John XII, whose reign in the 10th century was infamous for scandal. Though technically not a king, his papal processions counted as pageantry of the highest order. Chroniclers accused him of stumbling drunk through ceremonies, once even falling mid-blessing. Whether exaggerated or true, the humiliation cemented his reputation as a pope unworthy of pomp. As you drift between these spectacles, the theme sharpens. Pageantry magnified everything. A stumble became symbolic, a feint became failure, a misplaced lance became prophecy. Rulers risked more in public than in private, because every misstep had an audience. The irony lies in the fact that pageantry was supposed to conceal weakness, yet it so often exposed it. You pause at the edge of a glittering square. The crowd cheers, trumpets blare, a monarch waves. You know, from all you've seen tonight, how quickly it can change. A stumble, a slip, a cough, and the cheers become gasps. The great performance of monarchy always carried that hidden script, humiliation waiting in the wings, and as your eyes grow heavy, you realise the lesson is gentle but sure. In your own life, public moments carry risk. But unlike kings and queens, your stumbles rarely echo through centuries. Their embarrassment became legend, while yours fades by morning. With that comforting thought, you let the trumpets fade into silence. The night air feels damp now, heavy with the scent of river reeds and salt spray. Water glitters beneath moonlight, smooth as glass until a ripple stirs its surface. Monarchs adored water almost as much as they feared it. Rivers for transport, fountains for show, ornamental ponds for beauty, and seas for power. Yet water, patient and treacherous, claimed them as eagerly as any assassin. Tonight you walk along dripping stone embankments and lean over carved marble basins to glimpse kings and queens undone not by swords, but by the silence of drowning. The first image that rises is King Ludwig II of Bavaria, the mad king who built castles that seemed like something out of a dream. Neuschwanstein towers still pierce the clouds like a fairy tale, but Ludwigsend was no fairy tale. In June 1886 he was found dead in the shallow waters of Lake Starnberg alongside his physician. Was it suicide? Murder? Accident? Historians still argue. The embarrassment lies in the uncertainty. A king obsessed with theatrical beauty who filled his castles with illusions of grandeur ended face down in a few feet of lake water. You picture the still surface at dawn, a crown of lilies floating above him, while gossip churned louder than the waves. Further back, you encounter Seleucus II Callinicus, king of the Seleucid Empire in the 3rd century BCE. Some chronicles suggest he drowned in the Euphrates River after falling from his horse while crossing. Imagine the spectacle, a monarch whose army stretched across vast lands, undone by a single misstep into a current. Soldiers rushed to drag him back, but the river had already claimed its prize. A king's armour turned to anchor, his grandeur silenced by bubbles. You turn next to James II of Scotland, whose end we met earlier at Roxburgh with the exploding cannon. But his father, James I of Scotland, had an equally humiliating water story. In 1437, assassins burst into his chamber. James tried to escape through the sewer, but the exit had been blocked to prevent tennis balls from being lost down the drain. Trapped, he was cornered and killed. The irony stung. A king who might have escaped by water pipes, undone by his love of games. It wasn't drowning exactly, but his chamber, his drain, and his embarrassment all flow together into a watery humiliation. Another haunting tale belongs to William Adelin, the only legitimate son of King Henry I of England. In 1120, William sailed across the Channel on the White Ship, a vessel filled with young nobles. The crew, drunk, struck a rock, and the ship sank. Survivors claimed William might have escaped in a small boat, but when he turned back to rescue his half-sister, the boat was overwhelmed. He drowned, his promise of dynasty sinking with him. The embarrassment? An entire ship of England's future wiped out in a single reckless crossing, all because of arrogance and wine. Chroniclers whispered that the tragedy was punishment for hubris. Henry I never recovered, and England spiralled into civil war. In Denmark, the fate of King Eric V's sons carried similar shame. Several royal heirs drowned during travels across stormy seas, their deaths becoming cautionary tales about the danger of mixing celebration with ships. Ceremonial voyages meant to display majesty too often became funeral processions. Imagine the golden prows rocking, the silk banners whipping, before splintering into waves that cared nothing for crowns. And what of George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, the man rumoured to have drowned in a butt of wine? The details blur between execution and indulgence, but the image of his drowning became legend. Whether or not he truly inhaled his last in a cask of Malmsey, the embarrassment lies in the persistence of the tale. A duke remembered not for politics, but for bubbles of wine rising in the dark. Even Shakespeare seized it, immortalising the scene in Richard III. Crossing to the east, you find Emperor Maurice of Byzantium, executed in 602. Some accounts say he and his sons were forced into the waters of the Bosporus. A ruler once draped in robes of gold, stripped and drowned like a criminal. The embarrassment was sharpened by public display. Crowds watched, not with reverence, but with murmured satisfaction at his fall. Nearer to the Renaissance, you pause with Margaret of Austria, regent of the Netherlands. In 1530, she cut her foot while walking, and though infection killed her, rumours quickly attached themselves. She had stepped into water and never recovered. The symbolic drowning was too tempting for gossip to resist, turning an accidental wound into a humiliating narrative of fragility. And then there is Emperor Commodus again, whose reputation drowned long before his body did. He fancied himself Neptune reborn, sometimes parading in aquatic displays. Chroniclers mockingly imagined him slipping in pools, a waterlogged godling embarrassing himself before Rome. The literal assassination in his bath only added to the metaphor, an emperor who drowned in his own vanity. More chilling still is the fate of Louis II of Hungary. In 1526, after his forces were crushed by the Ottomans at Mohacs, he tried to flee. His horse stumbled into a river, and the young king drowned in his heavy armour. Imagine it. The battlefield smoke curling behind, the frantic splashing, the weight of steel pulling him down. Soldiers who found his body days later saw not majesty but a boyish king bloated by water. Historians still debate if he could have been saved, but the humiliation lingers. His dynasty ended not with valour, but with a stumble into mud. In Russia, Ivan VI, though assassinated in prison, had family members who perished by water. The Volga swallowed noble lives more than once, symbolic of a land whose rivers ruled harsher than any monarch. Attendants whispered that divine justice laughed hardest when it soaked the ermine. You pause at a pond in England, where George III's son, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, was rumoured to have slipped once in ornamental gardens. Though he survived, courtiers giggled that even heirs could not walk safely near water features. Gardens designed to impress became hazards waiting to humiliate. And then you reach the final, most ironic tale. The sinking of the Titanic in 1912 carried aboard nobles, peers and counts, their titles no protection against the Atlantic. Though not reigning monarchs, they were the aristocracy of Europe, undone by ice and arrogance. Survivors whispered of counts in silk dressing gowns, floundering like common men. Dignity dissolved in seawater. As you wander back from the riverside, the theme feels heavy yet strangely calming. Water does not discriminate. It swallows kings and peasants alike, crowns and boots alike. You think of Ludwig in his lake, Louis in his muddy river, William in his shattered ship. The most elegant pageantry of water, the gondola, the fountain, the banquet wine, can turn instantly to a drowning place. You close your eyes and hear it. The hush of waves against stone, the faint lapping of a fountain, the creak of timbers before they snap. Monarchs, it seems, were always one stumble, one cracked hull, one ripple away from humiliation. And as you drift toward your own sleep, you smile softly, reassured that the dangers of water are shared by all. The mighty and the humble both sink the same way. The torches flicker lower now, and you step into a corridor lined with tapestries embroidered with dragons, comets, and ominous signs. The air feels heavier, as if whispers cling to the walls. Monarchs feared war and rebellion, but in their darker moments they feared curses most of all. The unseen hands of fate, the whispered hex at a christening, the poisoned omen in a priest's words. Tonight you wander quietly through these superstitions, where rulers met their ends in ways so eerie that gossip turned them into victims of curses, mocked by destiny itself. The first tale that coils around you is that of Tutankhamun, the boy pharaoh whose tomb later spawned the legend of a curse. Though he ruled in the 14th century BCE and died young from illness or accident, it was centuries later, when his tomb was opened in 1922, that the myth of the pharaoh's curse arose. Several members of the excavation team died mysteriously, though science explains most deaths as coincidence or infection. Yet the embarrassment lingers in the image of a mighty ruler remembered not for policy, but for a supposed curse that turned his tomb into a punchline for superstition. Historians still argue whether Tut's own death was from malaria, a chariot accident or bone disease, but the word curse overshadows them all, branding him as the monarch forever associated with hexes. From Egypt you drift to England, where King John's death in 1216 was wrapped in gossip of curses. Chronicles say he died of dysentery after gorging on peaches and cider, but monks recorded that the people whispered of divine punishment. He had quarrelled with the church, lost Normandy, and earned the nickname John Softsword. His embarrassing end, sweating and moaning in a bed at Newark Castle, was painted as heaven's revenge. Priests preached that he was cursed, undone by his sins. His royal dignity shrank into the picture of a bloated man humbled by peaches, cider, and God's supposed wrath. Closer to the Renaissance, you pause at the legend of the Kennedy family. American royalty of a different kind. Though not crowned, their legacy feels stitched into the same pattern. The Kennedy curse became shorthand for the family's string of tragedies: assassinations, accidents, untimely deaths. The embarrassment of grandeur claimed by repeated misfortune fits right into this long tapestry of royal curses. You see it like an echo of older dynasties, showing how the idea of cursed bloodlines never really left history. But back to crowned rulers proper. Richard III of England was said to have been haunted by curses before his fall at Bosworth in 1485. Shakespeare immortalised the idea, putting prophetic curses in the mouths of women he had wronged. When Richard's body was unearthed in 2012, twisted by scoliosis, historians argued about how much of his cursed reputation was propaganda. Still, the humiliation endures. A king whose power collapsed in a muddy field, forever branded by words hissed at him decades earlier. Further east, you meet Tamerlane, the Central Asian conqueror. He died in 1405, but the true embarrassment came centuries later. In 1941, Soviet archaeologists opened his tomb in Samarkand despite local warnings. The inscription read, "Whoever opens this will unleash a greater invader than I." 2 days later, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. The coincidence fed the myth of a curse, transforming Tamerlane's rest into a cosmic joke. Even if Stalin later reburied him with ceremony before a Soviet victory, the legend lingered. Imagine the conqueror smirking in the afterlife, his bones more powerful than his armies. In Scotland, the Stuart dynasty carried its own superstitions. James VI, later James I of England, believed in witches and curses, publishing a treatise on demonology. His mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed in 1587, and Catholics claimed her death cursed the line. James's paranoia, his trials of supposed witches, and his obsession with omens embarrassed him, casting him as a king ruled by superstition rather than wisdom. Historians still debate whether his fear was genuine or political theatre, but the sight of a monarch trembling at curses undermined the image of majesty. France offers you another tale in Charles IX, the king who ordered the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572. Years later, he died young, coughing blood, his body failing. The people whispered that it was the curse of the slaughtered Huguenots, vengeance for the thousands he had murdered. His doctors insisted it was tuberculosis, but gossip was stronger. The king cursed by his own massacre. His reputation shriveled into a grim proverb about blood crying for blood. Even in Russia, curses loomed large. Ivan the Terrible killed his own son, Ivan Ivanovich, in a fit of rage in 1581, striking him with his staff. Days later, the son died. The Tsar, overcome with grief, was said to mutter that God had cursed his line, and indeed, his dynasty soon faltered, spiralling into the time of troubles. The humiliation here was not just the patricide, but the whispered sense that the dynasty had doomed itself by a father's hand. In Austria, the Habsburgs seemed to live under a hereditary curse. Inbreeding weakened the family tree until Charles II of Spain was born grotesquely frail, infertile, and mentally unstable. His reign ended with the Spanish succession crisis, and courtiers muttered about a family cursed for its arrogance. The physical evidence of the Habsburg jaw became both medical fact and cruel jest. Imagine the court painters smoothing over his twisted face in portraits, while servants whispered behind tapestries that the curse had claimed another. Even beyond dynasties, curses followed crowns. The curse of the pharaohs extended to other rulers who dabbled in Egypt. Napoleon's soldiers looted mummies, and later tales claimed the emperor himself was cursed, his career unravelling like linen bandages after Egypt. Though historians chalk it up to coincidence, the idea was deliciously embarrassing. The great general humbled not by Wellington, but by a dead priest's hex. And then there is King Croesus of Lydia, who asked the oracle at Delphi if he should go to war against Persia. The oracle replied that if he did, he would destroy a great empire. Confident, Croesus attacked, only to see his own empire destroyed. Was it a curse or clever wordplay? Either way, he became a parable of hubris. His humiliating defeat was remembered less as a military loss than as a monarch fooled by fate's joke. In Ireland, Brian Boru, the High King, fell in 1014 after his great victory at Clontarf. Though he had won, he was slain in his tent by fleeing Norsemen. Chroniclers later claimed he had been cursed by druids for hubris. The embarrassment lay in the irony. The hero of Ireland slain not on the field but in bed after winning, branded by superstition as doomed despite triumph. The thread that runs through these tales is simple but unnerving. Kings and queens, desperate to control destiny, fell victim to stories that destiny mocked them. Sometimes their deaths were ordinary, disease, accident, betrayal, but people wrapped them in curses to make sense of chaos. And once a curse clung, dignity evaporated. To die of illness was human. To die cursed was laughable. You lean against the wall of this corridor, shadows pressing close, and you hear it. Whispered names, muttered warnings, the faint chuckle of irony. Whether by prophecy, superstition, or gossip, the idea of a curse made sovereigns as fragile as commoners. And now, drifting further into your night, you take comfort in the soft realization. Curses only humiliate those who need their image to be flawless. For you, the imperfections are safe, ordinary, and almost soothing. The halls grow quieter, and now you hear a different sound. Claws scratching against stone, hooves pounding through undergrowth, the hiss of fangs. Monarchs claim dominion over beasts, dogs in gilded collars, falcons with jewelled hoods, lions carved into heraldic crests. Yet the animals themselves often seemed unimpressed by royal pretensions. Again and again, kings and queens discovered that the wild had claws sharper than any crown. Tonight, you follow the paw prints and hoof marks to witness rulers whose ends came not from armies or assassins, but from animals they underestimated. The first tale prowls toward you with the swagger of ancient legend, the death of Philip II of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great. Officially, he was assassinated by a bodyguard at a festival. But among the fringes of folklore, another version persisted, that omens of animals had long stalked his reign, and his fall was tied to them. He loved hunting lions, and some chroniclers whispered that a lion maimed him years before. Even if his literal end came by dagger, the imagery of a wounded king hobbling from an animal's strike lingered in the gossip of courtiers. Imagine the shame of a man who dreamed of ruling all Greece reduced to limping from a lion's bite. From Macedonia, you step into the forests of Hungary, where Bela I, a king whose throne collapsed beneath him as you've already seen, was also remembered for animal humiliation. Stories say he was once thrown from his horse in full parade, the beast bolting into the crowd. Nobles rushed to help him, but peasants laughed, and the king's fury at being mocked became legend. The horse had no care for protocol, and Bela's embarrassment rode alongside him for years. But the story of Sigurd the Mighty of Orkney, which you brushed against earlier, is perhaps the most iconic. After defeating a Scottish noble, Sigurd strapped the man's severed head to his saddle as a trophy. Yet as he rode, the head's teeth grazed his leg, cutting him. Infection set in, and soon Sigurd was dead. A Viking warrior, fierce and feared, slain not by armies but by the dental revenge of a corpse. Historians still argue how much is saga embellishment, but the poetic justice is undeniable. The dead man's bite outlived his own breath. In India, the Mughal emperors often staged grand hunts of elephants, tigers and lions. Jahangir, remembered for his fascination with nature, once nearly met his end when an elephant charged during a ceremonial hunt. Though attendants saved him, the humiliation lingered. An emperor, supposed master of beasts, scrambling behind servants. Even in paintings you can sense the tension between majesty and mockery. Jahangir's profile serene, while the background whispers of tusks that almost wrote his epitaph. The Roman Empire too gives you its share of animal revenge. Emperor Valentinian I in the 4th century loved hunting bears. Some chroniclers whispered that his fatal stroke in 375 CE was brought on by his fury when tribes mocked him. Fury that had already been provoked days earlier when a bear hunt went wrong, leaving him thrown from his horse and humiliated. The animal in effect wrote the prologue to his death. Rome's emperors were supposed to embody strength. To be outwitted by claws and teeth made their mortality far too visible. Closer to medieval France, King Philip the Fair's lineage carried another embarrassment. Louis X, called the Quarreller, died in 1316 after a bout of tennis, but legends embroidered his memory with earlier accidents involving horses that threw him. His dynasty's chroniclers were merciless. Kings who could command Europe, undone by rebellious steeds. Horses became the secret assassins of monarchs, throwing them at the worst possible moments. And then there's Alexander of Greece. Yes, the poor 20th century king whose pet monkey's quarrel led to a fatal infection. You picture him in the royal gardens, silk clothes rumpled, attendants gasping as the small animal sank its teeth into him. The king of Greece, felled by a monkey. The embarrassment lingers because it feels so absurdly human. Who among us hasn't underestimated a pet or a stray only to regret it? Yet for Alexander, the regret was final. The Ottomans provide another tale in Sultan Murad IV, who reigned in the 17th century. Though his actual death was from illness, stories of his hunts included humiliating moments when wild boars or lions turned on him. Chroniclers, eager to paint him as both fierce and flawed, exaggerated the danger of animals. The suggestion was always clear: beasts cared nothing for the Sultan's decree. Perhaps the most gruesome story comes from Tsar Peter III of Russia, who adored his toy soldiers and seemed more child than king. Rumours after his assassination claimed he once tried to ride a goat in his chambers, tumbling humiliatingly. Though not the cause of his literal death, the image of an emperor playing with animals while his throne slipped away became his legacy. Whether or not it was true, the humiliation clung tighter than any official chronicle. Back in England, King Henry I, besides his fatal indulgence in lampreys, was mocked for his clumsiness during hunts with stags. At one point, a stag nearly gored him, saved only by his guards. Imagine the gossip. A king scrambling behind attendants while his quarry nearly skewered him. The embarrassment was less about danger and more about dignity. A king supposed to represent order reduced to chaos in hooves and antlers. Further south, you wander into Moorish Spain, where rulers of Granada staged lion fights to prove bravery. Chroniclers love to recount moments when lions leapt too close, courtiers scattering. The king's trembling was remembered far longer than the victory. For monarchs, even surviving an animal attack could be humiliating if the fear showed. In Persia, Shah Abbas I was said to have narrowly escaped a leopard during a ceremonial hunt. Courtiers recorded the story, but gossip turned it into a mockery. The king, whose robes tore as he scrambled onto a horse. The leopard may have missed, but laughter didn't. And you cannot leave without glancing at King Gustav V of Sweden. Though his actual death came from illness in 1560, legends grew that he was once thrown from a horse during a public procession. The horse had bolted at the sight of a barking dog, the great reformer king, undone by a common mutt's yapping. Through all these tales you begin to notice the pattern. Kings sought to prove mastery over animals, to make beasts bow in spectacles of control. But animals, in their indifference, reminded them that crowns meant nothing to claws, tusks, teeth, or hooves. Sometimes the animal struck directly, sometimes indirectly, but the humiliation always clung like fur on velvet. You step out of the forest of these stories, the echoes of growls and whinnies fading. You realise the quiet truth. No matter how gilded the throne, the natural world will not bend to pageantry. A monkey bite, a horse's kick, a lion's leap, all could topple dynasties. And as you curl deeper into your own rest, you smile softly at the irony. For once, it is comforting to know that nature is perfectly democratic. It embarrasses everyone equally. The air around you shifts again. Gone is the musk of stables and the growl of wild beasts. Instead, you catch the heavy scent of ale, spiced wine, brandy and beer, the sticky perfume of intoxication that wafted through royal halls as readily as incense in a chapel. Kings and queens feasted, yes, but they also drank, sometimes to celebrate, sometimes to mourn, often just to pass long nights when rule felt unbearable. And as you lean against the carved oak of a great hall now, you see goblets overturned, tankards clattering, monarchs slumped red-faced on thrones. Alcohol offered brief escape from duty, but it also carried humiliation, and sometimes the final exit. Tonight you wander softly among drunken monarchs who never sobered up again. The first tale brims over from the ancient world. Alexander the Great himself, conqueror of Persia, master of half the known world, he's remembered as much for his appetite for wine as for his strategies. In 323 BCE, after a night of heavy drinking at the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, Alexander fell ill. Accounts differ. Some say poison, others fever, but many pointed at the endless toasts. He had consumed bowl after bowl of unmixed wine, the strongest kind, competing in a contest of endurance. Within days he was dead at 32. Historians still argue, was it poison, typhoid, or alcohol poisoning? The embarrassment is the same. Alexander, who never lost a battle, who bent kings to his will, felled not by enemy swords, but by his own thirst. You imagine the silence in the hall the next morning, the half-finished cup still warm, courtiers whispering that their immortal general had simply drunk himself mortal. You stumble forward now to the Nordic lands, where King Erik XIV of Sweden met his end in 1577. Imprisoned after madness and cruelty cost him his throne, he supposedly died from arsenic poisoning in a bowl of pea soup. But woven into the tale is the detail that he drank deeply the night before, staggering, slurring, mocking attendants until he collapsed into his final meal. Even if poison was the decisive blow, the embarrassment lay in the drunkenness. A once mighty king reduced to babbling over soup, his guards rolling eyes as they waited for him to pass out. Further south, you encounter King Selim II of the Ottoman Empire, remembered with the unflattering nickname Selim the Sot. Unlike his warrior ancestors, Selim preferred the pleasures of wine, women, and palaces. In 1574, after a night of heavy drinking, he slipped in the palace baths and struck his head. Some say the injury killed him. Others argue his liver had already given way. Either way, the humiliation stuck. The Sultan of the empire that had stormed Constantinople and threatened Europe, dead from a stumble brought on by drink. Historians still chuckle at the detail that his end owed less to armies and more to goblets. Across the Channel in England, King Edgar the Peaceful was famed for uniting his kingdom, but courtly whispers claimed that his death in 975 followed a long period of drunkenness and indulgence. Chroniclers softened it as excess, but the embarrassment rings clear. A ruler celebrated for peace undone by cups drained too eagerly. You picture him slumped on a bed of silks, servants tiptoeing around spilled ale as they tried to coax him upright. And then comes the story of Charles II of Navarre, a monarch whose final scene is legendary for humiliation. Afflicted by illness in 1387, he was wrapped in cloth soaked with brandy as treatment. A servant brought a candle too close, and the brandy ignited. The king burned alive, a monarch literally consumed by alcohol inside and out. Though technically not drunkenness, the symbolism was irresistible. Charles the Bad, ending in flames fed by liquor. People whispered of it for centuries, half in horror, half in grim laughter. Another court echo rises from Poland. King Stephen Bathory, though respected as a soldier, was mocked for his fondness for drink. In 1586 he died suddenly, perhaps from a stroke or kidney disease, but gossips insisted the cause was brandy. His enemies laughed that the great warrior had drowned his strength in wine. Historians still debate the truth, but the nickname Drinker King followed him to his grave. Back in Russia, Ivan the Terrible's court seethed with drunken violence. Though Ivan himself was a moderate drinker, many of his nobles weren't, and one, Prince Vladimir of Staritsa, reportedly collapsed after too much alcohol, possibly poisoned, but the story stuck as drunken disgrace. The court itself was remembered as a theatre of intoxication, and Ivan's dynasty stumbled toward its end in a haze of paranoia and ale. In Denmark you pause before Christian IV, a ruler famed for his building projects and naval power, yet his love of drink made him a laughingstock. He once fell from a horse while drunk, injuring himself so badly he never recovered. Though his official death in 1648 came later, his decline had long been mocked as the wages of drunkenness. Court poets, trying to flatter him, struggled to erase the image of a staggering king unable to mount his steed. And then there is Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, whose very reign was saturated with drunken anecdotes. Chroniclers accused him of spending more time drinking with tavern companions than ruling. By 1419, when he died of a stroke, the narrative had already been set, the king who drank himself useless. Though the stroke might have come regardless, gossip hardened it into humiliation, proof that indulgence had hollowed him. One of the strangest tales belongs to Alexander of Greece, the king bitten by a monkey. But court rumours insisted he had been drinking beforehand, staggering through the gardens, too careless to avoid the animal's quarrel. Whether true or not, the story wove intoxication into his humiliation. In England again, you find William IV, who, though he lived longer, was mocked throughout his life for drunken antics. One chronicler remarked that he often passed out in public, even before becoming king. Though his death in 1837 was from illness, his reputation as the sailor king who loved his rum ensured that many joked he'd eventually drink himself to death anyway. His actual passing was almost overshadowed by the tales of earlier drunken fools. Even in antiquity the pattern is clear. Roman emperors such as Vitellius were notorious for gluttony and drink. Vitellius, in 69 CE, consumed entire banquets of food and oceans of wine. When he was eventually killed during the Year of the Four Emperors, his body was dragged through the streets. The humiliation wasn't just defeat, it was the sneering memory that he had drowned himself in luxury long before soldiers finished him. As you lean against the wall, the goblets glinting in torchlight, the theme settles like a drowsy weight. Alcohol gave monarchs confidence, bravado, a way to mask fear. But it also stripped them of dignity, making them clumsy, foolish, vulnerable. A stumble in the bath, a slip in the hunt, a slurred word at a council meeting. These became the details remembered longest. You picture Alexander the Great raising his final cup, Selim slipping in steam, Charles of Navarre wrapped in brandy flames. The laughter of history feels gentle now, almost forgiving. After all, who hasn't overindulged? The difference is only that kings had audiences for their stumbles. As your eyelids droop, you hear the faint clink of goblets in some long-ago hall, the last laugh of courtiers, the splash of spilled wine on stone, and you realise with a soft smile that for all their crowns and banners, kings were undone by the same cups that undo ordinary men at taverns. The great equaliser flows red and golden, and no dynasty has ever been proof against it. The soft hum of night follows you now into another chamber. This one filled with fabrics, glittering jewels, gilded crowns and robes so heavy they could crush the spine. Monarchs adored costumes, ermine-trimmed cloaks, pearl-encrusted gowns, shoes with silver buckles. Yet the very splendour meant to announce authority sometimes turned into the stage of their undoing. Tonight you wander past wardrobes of velvet and satin, past mirrors where kings admired themselves, only to discover that their own finery betrayed them. The first image you see is of George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, already remembered for drowning in a butt of Malmsey wine. But chroniclers also joked about his passion for fine clothes, claiming he once bankrupted himself chasing silks. The irony stuck. A man who swaddled himself in luxury, finally wrapped forever in liquid splendour. Historians still debate whether the wine barrel execution was real or legend, but the story remains because it highlights the comedy of fashion and drink conspiring together. Then you drift towards Spain, where Queen Isabella of Aragon, one of the many noble Isabellas, reportedly fainted beneath the weight of her coronation gown. Though she survived, gossip exaggerated the incident into humiliation. A queen toppling before her crown even settled. The robe, meant to symbolise eternity, became a burden too heavy for flesh. Imagine the crowd gasping, attendants rushing, the sound of pearls scattering across marble. A monarch, felled by her own embroidery. In England, you stop at Richard II, who adored costume almost more than governance. He commissioned robes so heavy with jewels they strained his shoulders. Chroniclers whispered that he often staggered under them, his youth and vanity mocked by courtiers. Though his death came later in captivity, the memory of him swaying in bejewelled cloaks undermined his dignity long before. Fashion, meant as power, became parody. The French court, master of spectacle, offers countless tales. One that gleams is the story of Francis I, who loved masquerade balls. At one such festivity in 1525, he and companions dressed as wild men, their costumes coated in pitch and flax. A torch touched them, and the king nearly burned alive. Several courtiers perished. Francis survived only by luck. The humiliation was obvious. The mighty monarch reduced to a fool in charred costume, his vanity nearly his pyre. You drift into the Renaissance again, where Henry VIII of England emerges in silk doublets and vast furs. Late in life, his obesity and sores made wearing finery torturous. He had to be hoisted into armour, and attendants whispered about the stench beneath the cloth. Though he did not die directly from his costumes, the embarrassment of a once vibrant monarch trapped in fabric became legend. He drowned in cloth long before death took him. In Russia, Tsar Paul I carried a similar humiliation. Obsessed with military uniforms, he forced his court to wear Prussian-style outfits of unbearable discomfort. Ironically, Paul himself stumbled during parades, his boots too stiff, his collar choking. His assassination in 1801 was political, but gossip tied it to ridicule. An emperor strangled not only by conspirators, but by his obsession with suffocating uniforms. Back in Byzantium, you encounter Michael VII, mocked for his extravagance in jewels. His courtiers joked that he might collapse under the sheer weight of his regalia. When he was finally deposed, the image of him stripped of crown and robes was doubly humiliating. The man once drowned in gems left bare, his splendour proven hollow. A darker story is that of Sigismund of Burgundy. At a ceremony, his cloak caught in the stirrup as he dismounted, dragging him clumsily before a crowd. Though not fatal, the image of a king tangled in his own velvet was indelible. Chroniclers delighted in recording such indignities. Even more famous is Charles VIII of France, who we last saw bumping his head fatally on a doorway. But long before that, his court mocked him for appearing in oversized costumes that dwarfed his thin frame. The irony of a king swallowed by his own robe foreshadowed his later humiliation in death. In the Ottoman Empire, robes of honour were central to ceremony. Yet one tale tells of a prince strangled with a silken bowstring, costume turned executioner. The very fabric symbolising wealth became his noose. Here, humiliation sharpened into cruelty. The wardrobe is both glory and doom. You glance east to China, where Ming emperors wore dragon robes weighing dozens of pounds. One, the Wanli emperor, grew so obese that he needed attendants to lift the robe upon him. At court rituals he could hardly breathe beneath the brocade. His later death from illness was whispered as the robe's revenge, an emperor smothered by his own dragon finery. And what of Louis XVI of France? During his attempted escape in 1791, he and his family disguised themselves as commoners. But his awkward gait in simple costume betrayed him. Witnesses noticed that he moved like a king. The disguise failed, the family was captured, and the humiliation echoed. A monarch who could not pass as a peasant tripped up by costume again. In Persia, Shah Abbas II was famed for robes so lavish they trailed behind him. Once, during a procession, his garment caught on a nail, ripping loudly. Courtiers gasped, peasants laughed. The rip became a metaphor for his reign, grandeur undone by a small tear. Back in England, King George IV adored silks and satins. His obesity made him sweat through them, staining fabric in public. Caricaturists immortalised him as a bloated man drowning in lace. Though he died in 1830 of illness, his legacy was stained silk more than statesmanship. As you wander among these costumes, the theme shines through. Finery was meant to conceal weakness, but often it revealed it. Jewels crushed shoulders, cloaks tripped feet, disguises betrayed, silks smothered. Coronets slid, crowns pinched, embroidery burned. Kings and queens became victims of their own pageantry, costumes turning into cages. You imagine the silence after each accident, the gasp of the crowd, the frantic attendants, the whisper of laughter. Power looked most fragile when smothered in satin. And now, as your eyes grow heavy, you feel comforted. If even monarchs could be tripped up by their wardrobes, then your own clumsy moments with buttons or shoelaces seem small indeed. Dignity, like silk, tears easily. The candles sputter lower as you step into another hall, this one lined with portraits of rulers who laughed at fate, only for fate to laugh back. Irony has always been history's sly accomplice, and monarchs, with their need to appear invincible, made perfect targets. Tonight, you lean against the stone, listening to whispers of kings and queens who mocked death, ignored warnings or sneered at omens, only to perish in ways that turned their own bravado into a final punchline. The first story to shuffle forward is that of Charles XII of Sweden, the warrior king who spent most of his reign in boots and battlefields. He was famed for his daring, sneering at danger. In 1718, during the siege of Fredriksten in Norway, he stood peering over the trenches, mocking warnings to keep his head down. Moments later, a bullet pierced his skull. Historians still argue whether it came from an enemy sniper or his own disgruntled troops, but the irony rings louder than the shot. The king who mocked caution, undone by the very carelessness he prided himself on. From Sweden, you wander to England, where Oliver Cromwell's nemesis, Charles II, lived a life of indulgence. He joked often about his health, dismissing advice. In 1685, after years of ignoring symptoms, he collapsed suddenly from a seizure. His physicians bled him, cupped him, dosed him with potions, an entire arsenal of cures he had once scoffed at. The irony? The merry monarch who laughed at medical fuss was killed by medical fuss. He lingered for days, half poisoned by remedies. Courtiers whispered that he died more from doctors than disease. Your next step takes you back to Byzantium. Julian the Apostate, last of Rome's pagan emperors, mocked Christianity as weak. In 363 CE, while campaigning in Persia, he charged recklessly into battle without armour, sneering at warnings. A spear pierced his side, and he collapsed. Later Christian writers gleefully embroidered the irony. The man who rejected Christ bled out crying to pagan gods who did not answer. Historians debate the dramatisation, but the scene of a proud scoffer humbled on the battlefield endures. Irony also clung to Holy Roman Emperor Joseph I. In the early 1700s, during a smallpox outbreak, he laughed at warnings to avoid certain crowds. Within weeks, he was dead of the disease. His death plunged Europe into a succession crisis. The irony wasn't lost on his courtiers. The emperor who dismissed contagion, felled by the very plague he belittled. Even in candlelit whispers, the laughter was grim, mockery turned boomerang. And then there's King Henry I of England, who you've met before with his surfeit of lampreys. Physicians had begged him to avoid the oily dish, warning his digestion was too frail. Henry laughed at them, proclaiming that kings did not obey diet restrictions. Days later, his stomach revolted, and he was dead. Chroniclers loved the symmetry, the stubborn king, undone by his own stubbornness. Historians still argue if it was lampreys, food poisoning or illness, but the joke remains. Louis XV of France offers another echo. For years he had mocked his critics, revelling in court pleasure. In 1774, when he fell ill with smallpox, courtiers noted the irony. He had once laughed at warnings about immorality and divine punishment. His death was slow, pustules scarring the beloved king. The embarrassment lay in the contrast. Once adored, he died shunned. Even his body feared. His indulgence became his epitaph. You step further into medieval Scotland, where James I of Scotland mocked prophecies about his death. He ordered the drainage of a sewer passage beneath Perth's Blackfriars Monastery to prevent tennis balls from rolling away. Years later, in 1437, assassins burst into his chamber. James tried to escape down the very sewer, but the exit was blocked. He was trapped and killed. Historians still marvel at the cruel irony. A king murdered because he wanted to keep track of his tennis balls. The irony grows sharper in the tale of Emperor Valentinian II. He mocked omens, claiming he feared neither men nor spirits. In 392 CE, he was found hanged in his palace. Suicide. Murder? Historians still argue. But the irony is undeniable. The emperor who mocked fate found himself undone in a manner that screamed of fate's revenge. In Spain, Charles II, the sickly Habsburg, was plagued by irony his entire life. Courtiers called him the Bewitched. He had mocked attempts at exorcism, yet his death in 1700 was interpreted as a triumph of curses. He had laughed at omens, but his people saw omens fulfilled. His body, frail and twisted, made the irony too easy. The king who scoffed at curses became the poster child for them. Even Napoleon, the iron-willed emperor, was shadowed by irony. He had sneered at omens, mocked fortune-tellers, laughed at prophecies. Yet his star seemed to obey prophecy's cruel rhythm, his rise meteoric, his fall foretold. Exiled to St. Helena, he muttered bitterly about fate. And when he died in 1821, it was likely stomach cancer, but many whispered it was poison, fulfilling earlier warnings. The man who mocked superstition ended his life drowning in it. The irony was not always cosmic, sometimes it was personal. Consider King Martin of Aragon. In 1410, after gorging on an entire goose, he collapsed laughing at a joke told by his jester. The irony was immediate, the king who demanded constant amusement dead from laughter itself. Chroniclers couldn't resist the punchline. A monarch remembered not for laws or wars, but for dying of the very indulgence he craved. Another story unfurls in Persia with Shah Safi I. Known for mocking his own physicians, he once jeered that he was too royal to fall to common disease. Soon after, he died from cirrhosis, his body wasted by alcohol. The irony was not just death, but the way it proved his courtiers' warnings correct. His throne sat empty, his goblet still sticky with wine. And you cannot skip Catherine the Great of Russia, whose actual death in 1796 came from a stroke. Yet gossip insisted for centuries that she had died in an obscene manner, crushed beneath a horse during an attempt at unnatural pleasure. Historians dismiss this as slander, but the persistence of the rumour speaks to irony's cruelty. A woman mocked for power, remembered not for empire but for a horse. The irony was invented, but it humiliated nonetheless. You drift back toward Rome, where Emperor Caracalla sneered at enemies, claiming he was protected by Mars. Yet in 217 CE, while relieving himself by the roadside during campaign, a soldier assassinated him. The irony was brutal. The emperor who invoked gods slain during the most mundane act. His death remembered more for the toilet than for Mars. Through all these stories, you begin to sense irony as history's quiet assassin. Monarchs who mocked disease, undone by it. Kings who scoffed at omens, trapped by them. Rulers who ignored warnings, struck by exactly what they ignored. Their humiliation lies in the poetic symmetry. Fate, with a smirk, arranged deaths like punchlines. You pause at the end of this gallery of irony and smile softly. Perhaps the comfort lies here. History may play cruel jokes, but it also reveals how little difference there is between crowns and commoners. Everyone mocks advice. Everyone ignores warnings. Everyone meets their own irony in time. The only difference is that monarchs had their embarrassment recorded in golden ink. And as you sink deeper into the calm of night, you hear faint laughter. History's laughter. Gentle, mocking, but also forgiving. You let it carry you into rest, where irony has no sting, only the softness of recognition. The ground under your feet feels different now. Muddy, uneven, strewn with the echoes of shields and broken lances. You hear the clash of steel and the thud of arrows, the distant roar of armies chanting their king's name. The battlefield was meant to be the theatre of glory, the place where monarchs carved their names into legend. Yet more often than they cared to admit, it became a stage for humiliation. Tonight, you walk among banners half buried in dirt to witness rulers who set out to win renown in combat, but instead met endings that looked more like farce than valour. The first shadow that stumbles toward you is King Harold II of England, whose death at Hastings in 1066 remains iconic. The Bayeux Tapestry famously depicts him pierced in the eye by an arrow. Some scholars now think he was cut down by Norman knights, but the arrow in the eye story persisted because it felt so ironically embarrassing. A king who had marshalled his forces, who had sprinted south after victory over the Vikings at Stamford Bridge, undone by a stray shot to the face. Historians still argue over the detail, but you can imagine the laughter in Norman camps. Harold, the last Saxon king, killed not by grand strategy but by a chance arrow. Further east, you meet Emperor Valens of Rome. In 378 CE, at the Battle of Adrianople, Valens faced the Goths. Overconfident, he refused to wait for reinforcements. The Goths encircled his army, chaos erupted, and Valens fled to a farmhouse. The Goths set it on fire, and the emperor burned alive inside. The humiliation was complete. A Roman emperor reduced to ashes in a peasant hut, not even given a hero's body to bury. The battlefield that should have made his reputation instead erased it. In Hungary, King Louis II carried his humiliation into water, as you saw before at Mohács in 1526. His young armoured body slipped into a river while retreating. Soldiers later found him drowned, his crown lost in the mud. The battlefield fiasco here was double, an army crushed and a king who couldn't even escape without stumbling into a puddle that became his grave. His dynasty ended with him, his legacy a soggy embarrassment whispered across Europe. From Hungary you step north to Poland. King Władysław III, known as Władysław of Varna, charged heroically into Ottoman lines in 1444. His horse carried him too deep, and he was cut down. Chroniclers note that his head was displayed by the enemy, a grim trophy. The humiliation. His rashness cost his entire army the day, and his bold charge looked less like bravery than like a child running headlong into danger. Historians still debate whether it was courage or folly, but in either case, his name is tied more to disaster than to triumph. France too had its battlefield fools. King John II, called John the Good, fought at Poitiers in 1356. Outnumbered by the English, he nevertheless pressed the attack. His forces crumbled and John was captured. Chroniclers report him fighting bravely, but the image that stuck was humiliating. A king dragged away into captivity, ransomed like any common knight. His reign became a joke. Good John, who lost his kingdom and freedom in one blow. The battlefield had crowned his enemies instead. England offers another embarrassment with Richard III at Bosworth in 1485. His cry of a horse, my kingdom for a horse," immortalised by Shakespeare. captures the farce. Whether he truly said it or not, the legend persists. A king who had manoeuvred through intrigue and bloodshed, begging for a horse as mud sucked at his boots, before being cut down by Henry Tudor's men. His body was later buried hastily under a Leicester parking lot, an ignominy discovered only in 2012. Historians note that his scoliosis may have hindered him, but in popular memory, the humiliation of desperation defines him. Back to Rome, where Marcus Licinius Crassus, though not an emperor, one of the triumvirs, provides another fiasco. At Carrhae in 53 BCE, he led Roman forces against the Parthians. Overconfident and greedy, he bungled strategy, allowed his army to be trapped, and was killed. The Parthians, mocking his lust for wealth, allegedly poured molten gold down his throat. Whether legend or not, the humiliation is perfect. A man obsessed with riches, drowned in it in death. The Crusades provide their own fiascos. Frederick Barbarossa, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, drowned in the Salif River in 1290 while trying to cross in armour. His army, leaderless, scattered. Historians call it a catastrophe of the Third Crusade. The humiliation lies not only in the drowning, but in the waste. An emperor who had marched hundreds of miles undone by slippery rocks and cold water. His followers wept, but the laughter of irony was louder. You wander next to France again, where Louis XVI, though executed on the scaffold, also carried battlefield humiliation. As Dauphin, he trained in hunting and mock battles, often failing miserably. Courtiers whispered about his clumsiness, foreshadowing his later political ineptitude. His death was political, but his life was littered with fiascos of martial incompetence that made the guillotine seem less shocking. Closer to Scotland, you meet Robert III, who never saw much combat. Yet his humiliation came from being too weak to ride to battle at all. Chroniclers mocked him for sending others in his stead. When his son died in suspicious circumstances, Robert collapsed, embarrassed by impotence as much as grief. His epitaph might as well have been, "He failed to show up." Even more pitiful is the story of Emperor Constantine XI, last emperor of Byzantium. In 1453, as the Ottomans stormed Constantinople, he discarded his regalia, fought as a common soldier, and was cut down. His courage was real, but the humiliation lingered in the details. The Emperor of Rome, slain nameless in the dust, his body so lost it could not be identified. Some said it was divine irony, others tragic poetry. Either way, the battlefield did not crown him with dignity. The irony of kings in battle is clearest with Napoleon too. Though not technically a monarch until crowning himself, his Waterloo fiasco in 1815 was the humiliation of all humiliations. Mud, rain, and hesitation cost him the field. He who had boasted of destiny was reduced to fleeing in a carriage, his hat trampled in the mire. Historians still argue over his choices that day, but popular memory sees only the small figure in grey coat, undone by mud and indecision. You notice, as you pace among these fallen banners, that embarrassment clings strongest not to failure itself, but to failure in the wrong costume. Kings expected to die gloriously, swords in hand, sunlight gleaming on armour. Instead, they drowned in streams, burned in huts, begged for horses, or simply vanished in the crush of soldiers. Dignity dissolved in mud. And isn't that the lesson whispered softly tonight? That pride and spectacle are fragile things. You might prepare, plan, even boast, but a stumble, a missed arrow, a muddy puddle can rewrite destiny. For kings, it meant centuries of mockery. For you, it might mean nothing more than a laugh among friends. Either way, the field remembers. You turn away from the imagined battlefield, ears still ringing with phantom cries, and let the silence return. Somewhere far off, a banner falls into mud, and you realise, with a smile, that history's greatest warriors often ended not as lions, but as clowns in armour. The drums fade, the battlefield's smoke dissolves, and now you enter a different kind of stage. Here, the air is thick with candle wax and perfume. Courtiers whisper from balconies, and monarchs stride like actors, rehearsed in their every gesture. Pageantry never really ended when battles did. It simply moved into courts, palaces, and cathedrals. Yet as you wander through this theatre of thrones, you realise that many kings and queens died mid-performance. Sometimes literally on stage, sometimes in the middle of a speech, sometimes in prayer. Death didn't wait for curtains to close. It barged in mid-scene, turning dignified rituals into awkward comedies. Tonight, you sit in the velvet seats of history and watch rulers who died not quietly, but theatrically. The first act belongs to King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King himself. He didn't collapse mid-dance, but he staged his life so elaborately that his death became theatre by default. For weeks in 1715, his courtiers shuffled in and out of his chamber to watch him fade. Louis, who once performed as Apollo in ballets, now grimaced in agony from gangrene. The irony was that he had demanded his life be a spectacle, and so his death became one too. Historians note that the court marvelled at his majestic suffering. Imagine a king delivering his final lines to an audience of dukes, every groan a performance. Embarrassment seeped in because he had no choice. His most private pain became public drama. Yet some monarchs didn't even get that dignity. Consider Emperor Commodus of Rome. We've already glimpsed his obsession with gladiatorial theatrics, but his assassination in 192 CE capped his foolishness. Poisoned, then strangled, Commodus had planned to open the new year by appearing as a gladiator before Rome. Theatrics had defined him so thoroughly that even his death felt like a grotesque parody. The Senate ordered his memory damned, but the humiliation lingered. An emperor remembered as a clown who confused empire with spectacle. The English stage offers another scene. King Edward VI, the boy king, gave a final speech in 1553 urging Protestant continuity. But his frail body betrayed him mid-performance. He coughed blood, gasped, and collapsed. The court watched, horrified, as his words broke apart under the strain. Historians argue whether it was tuberculosis or poisoning, but what mattered in memory was the scene, a king's faith dramatised by his own collapse. A sermon turned into an unintended tragedy. Then comes King Martin of Aragon, whose death you've already brushed against, stuffed from a goose dinner, laughing too hard at a jester's joke. The jester's punchline was supposed to close the evening. Instead, it closed the king's life. Dying of laughter sounds poetic, but in courtly memory it was humiliating. A monarch remembered not for policy, but for chuckling himself into eternity. Imagine courtiers staring, unsure whether to laugh or weep, as the king's wheezes turned fatal. Spain gives you another act with Philip III. In 1621, he lingered near a brazier that overheated the room. Etiquette prevented servants from moving it without royal permission. The king fainted from the heat, developed fever, and died. A monarch felled not by rebellion, but by theatrical protocol, servants too afraid to interrupt the performance of etiquette. Historians still argue about exaggeration, but the embarrassment lies in the absurdity. A king roasted by his own formality. France's Louis XVIII had his own awkward scene. Enormously overweight, afflicted with gout, he insisted on continuing public ceremonies. Once, mid-audience, he collapsed in his chair, barely able to breathe, courtiers panicking as he gasped. Though he recovered temporarily, his eventual death in 1824 was remembered less as a solemn passing than as a bloated body giving out mid-performance. Caricaturists feasted on the irony, a monarch whose reign ended like a farce. In Byzantium, Emperor Romanos I Lekapenos offered another embarrassment. During a religious ceremony, he fainted dramatically, collapsing before patriarchs. His weakness became gossip, fueling conspiracies that led to his deposition. He didn't die then, but his dignity did. In memory, his fainting fit stood in for his downfall. A reminder that fainting on stage was more fatal than daggers in the dark. Moving east, you stumble into Japan. Shogun Tokugawa Iemochi died in 1866 after a long illness, but witnesses recalled that he collapsed mid-prayer during a public ritual. To collapse before the gods, robes askew, attendants rushing, was humiliation in a culture where composure was everything. Theatrics betrayed him, turning devotion into spectacle. Even the papacy saw theatrical deaths. Pope John XXI was studying in his library in 1277 when the ceiling collapsed on him. Scholars whispered that he had been writing about prophecy, irony sharpening the scene. A pope lecturing on fate crushed mid-performance by bricks. His death became legend, a cosmic joke played out on the stage of scholarship. England's Henry I also carried theatrics into his final days. After ignoring warnings about lampreys, he fell ill. Chroniclers describe him raving and gasping in front of attendants, a grotesque performance no one wanted tickets to. His death became less about solemn passing, and more about the memory of his bloated body convulsing before horrified courtiers. Further east, Emperor Constantine XI of Byzantium staged his own death. In 1453, as the Ottomans stormed Constantinople, he threw off his regalia and charged into battle disguised as a common soldier. His death was dramatic but humiliating in its anonymity. No one could find his body afterward, a theatrical gesture that erased him from the stage altogether. Historians still debate whether this was heroic or pathetic, but the irony lingers. The last Roman emperor vanished without a curtain call. The Habsburg court had its own drama with Emperor Leopold I. Obsessed with opera, he staged endless performances. Yet he died in 1705 after collapsing mid-audience at a musical event. Imagine the scene. Violins soaring, courtiers applauding, the emperor slumping suddenly in his box. His death blurred into the music, humiliation wrapped in spectacle. Napoleon, though his exile death was quiet, had theatrical humiliations during campaigns. At Leipzig in 1813, he fled under cover of night, his bridge prematurely destroyed, leaving troops stranded. Soldiers mocked that their emperor had vanished like a poor actor forgetting his lines. His reputation carried more farce than triumph in those final years. Theatrics also betrayed Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. In 1632, at the Battle of Lutzen, thick fog obscured the fight. He charged flamboyantly into the mist, as if the battlefield were a stage. Moments later he was shot and trampled. His death was dramatic, but his decision to ride without armour made it humiliating. Theatrics overrode caution. As you pace through these scenes, the pattern sharpens. Monarchs wanted to be remembered for dignity, but death often caught them mid-performance, mid-joust, mid-prayer, mid-speech, mid-laughter. Their audiences gasped, attendants scrambled, and the show ended not with applause, but with embarrassment. You sit in the velvet of your own imagination, curtain heavy in the air. The lesson is gentle, even comforting. Life itself is a performance, and sometimes the final act is clumsy. Kings and queens were no exception. Their mistakes were remembered because they had an audience. Yours mercifully fade in silence, and as your eyelids close you can almost hear the curtain drawing, the last line spoken awkwardly, the orchestra stumbling into rest. History laughs softly, forgivingly, reminding you that every exit is a little theatrical, and no one leaves the stage gracefully forever. The banquet tables and glittering costumes fade into a softer light now, the quiet rhythm of spoons against bowls and the rustle of parchment recipes filling the air. Monarchs, for all their grandeur, were human beings with peculiar tastes, obsessions with certain dishes, bizarre diets, or odd remedies whispered by physicians. Tonight you walk past steaming cauldrons, flagons of tonic, jars of powders, and bottles of elixirs. The kitchen and the apothecary were as deadly as the battlefield. The embarrassing part: so many kings and queens chose their doom willingly, spoon by spoon, fad by fad. The first monarch who staggers toward you is Henry I of England. Yes, you've seen him already with his lampreys, but it is worth savouring the detail again. This was a king explicitly warned by his doctors. The oily eels would kill him. He ignored them, laughed even, then ate his fill and collapsed. Imagine courtiers muttering under breath, "The king will die of stubbornness?" He did. Historians still debate whether it was food poisoning or chronic illness, but the story stuck because it is so deliciously humiliating. A mighty king undone by a plate of ugly fish. Next comes Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. He adored food and, more disastrously, rich drink. By midlife he was so plagued by gout that he could barely walk. Yet instead of moderation, he clung to feasts of red meat and beer. In 1558 he died, bloated and twisted, his body betraying him. Embarrassment clung to his legacy, not the emperor of half the world, but the monarch who let his appetite gnaw at him until the end. His retreat to a monastery, where he still demanded elaborate meals, made him seem like a man unable to leave the table even when he left the throne. From Austria comes another indulgence. Emperor Franz Joseph's consort, Empress Elizabeth Sisi, was famed for extreme dieting. Obsessed with slimness, she barely ate, existing on broth, milk and oranges. Though she lived until assassinated in 1898, her health had long been compromised by the fad. The humiliation was whispered in gossip. A queen so enslaved to beauty ideals that she starved herself into fragility. Royal habits, it seemed, were chains. France provides you with Louis XV, who adored chocolate. He had it prepared daily in elaborate ways, drinking so much that physicians fretted over his digestion. Though his death came from smallpox, courtiers loved to joke that the king might drown in cocoa first. His mistresses teased him about his sticky fingers, turning indulgence into humiliation. Imagine the golden cups, the froth of cocoa clinging to royal lips, and the snickers of courtiers behind their fans. Then there's Rudolph II, Holy Roman Emperor, who stuffed his courts with alchemists and strange remedies. Obsessed with elixirs promising eternal life, he consumed concoctions of mercury and gold. These only worsened his mental instability. By the time he died in 1612, he was mocked as a monarch poisoned by his own vanity, more patient than emperor. Historians still argue about the exact toll of those alchemical experiments, but the embarrassment is obvious. A sovereign who killed himself chasing immortality. England's King George IV likewise indulged bizarrely. Gluttony chained him. Mountains of meat, oceans of alcohol, sugary sweets. By his 40s he weighed over 300 pounds, his body swollen, his breath wheezing. In 1830 he died bloated and mocked by his subjects, lampooned in caricatures that depicted him drowning in pudding and port. He had spent his reign obsessed with indulgence, and his death was proof that habit was his true ruler. Not all embarrassing ends came from overindulgence, some from medical fads. Take Catherine de' Medici's French court, where nobles popularised unicorn horn powder as a cure for poison. Royals consumed it daily, sprinkling it on food. Of course, it was ground narwhal tusk, useless and expensive. While Catherine herself didn't die from it, many courtiers ruined their health relying on magical dust. Imagine kings sneezing over their roast beef, powdered narwhal sticking to their lips, believing themselves safe from fate. History chuckles. You drift to Russia, where Tsar Nicholas I adored a dangerous habit, cold baths in freezing rivers. He believed it braced his constitution. In 1855, he caught pneumonia after one such plunge. His body gave out soon after. The embarrassment was clear. The Tsar, who thought himself strengthened by icy water, was killed by it instead. When he died in 1700, people whispered that he was less king than experiment. Embarrassment lingered not only in his body but in the fact that he had believed so eagerly in absurd cures. The Tudors provide more grim comedy. Elizabeth I, terrified of illness, dosed herself with daily tonics of vinegar and herbs. While she lived long, the obsession left her teeth blackened and her body weakened. Courtiers whispered about her foul breath. The Virgin Queen, glorious in portraits, was mocked behind her back for reeking of vinegar. Death spared her dignity somewhat, but the habit had already undone her aura. The Habsburgs appear again with Maximilian I of Mexico. Obsessed with imported European remedies, he ignored the reality of Mexican climate and diet. While captured in 1867, he still demanded special wines and elixirs. Though executed by firing squad, his insistence on delicate diets embarrassed him to the end. A monarch concerned with his palate more than his people became an easy target of ridicule. Farther back you hear of Mithridates VI of Pontus. Terrified of poison, he dosed himself daily with antidotes, building resistance. When he tried to commit suicide after defeat, poison failed him. He had to beg a soldier to finish him with a sword. Irony bit hard. The king who prided himself on cleverness trapped by his own obsession. Embarrassment echoes in every retelling. China's Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor obsessed with immortality, consumed mercury pills given by alchemists. His mind deteriorated, paranoia grew, and he died in 210 BCE, effectively poisoned by his quest for eternal life. Imagine his courtiers whispering nervously as their emperor demanded more immortality pills, even as his skin turned grey. The humiliation is timeless, a ruler killed by the very cure he demanded. In Persia, Shah Abbas II followed a similar path, dosing himself with opium daily. His dependence weakened him until death. Opium, once considered medicinal, became his cage. The Shah who commanded armies could not command his own cravings. The French again offer Louis XIII, who consumed endless enemas as a fad cure. Physicians recommended them daily. His fragile body wasted away, and courtiers snickered at the king whose throne was rivalled by his commode. Embarrassment clung long after. From Mughal India, Jahangir adored opium and wine, using them together until his body gave out in 1627. Though remembered for his gardens and art, his death carried whispers of humiliation, the emperor who drowned in his habits. You notice now how repetitive the pattern is. Rulers feared poison, so they swallowed absurd antidotes. They feared weakness, so they plunged into cold baths or dosed with wine. They feared insignificance, so they filled themselves with food. Yet each habit backfired, leaving them exposed. You lean against the kitchen doorway, hearing pots bubbling and bottles clinking. The lesson feels soft now. No crown protects from foolish choices. Monarchs who ruled millions could not rule themselves. Their habits became their eulogies. And as your eyes grow heavier, you let the smells fade. Vinegar, wine, mercury, cocoa, roasted lampreys. You smile at the comfort that your own habits, however clumsy, won't be painted into history's mocking pages. Kings and queens died of them. You only laugh at them. The night draws you now into softer chambers, rooms heavy with perfume, beds tangled in silk, gardens echoing with whispers and hurried footsteps. For all their crowns and ceremonies, monarchs were human in longing. Affairs, trysts, secret passions, or desperate grabs for love often ended not in romance but in humiliation. Tonight you pass through perfumed corridors and moonlit bowers where rulers died of passion, or at least in circumstances where passion robbed them of dignity. The first figure to drift toward you is King Edward II of England, already infamous for rumours of weakness. His death in 1327 at Berkeley Castle remains debated, with the lurid tale of a red-hot poker thrust into his body often dismissed as propaganda. But why did that story stick? Because it tied humiliation to love. Edward's close relationships with male favourites had scandalised contemporaries, so chroniclers made his death reflect the gossip. Even if he was merely strangled, the legend of unnatural passion punished became his epitaph. Historians still argue fiercely, but the embarrassment lay in being remembered more for mocked intimacy than monarchy. From England you step to France, where King Henri III, murdered in 1589, was already a byword for effeminacy. His court was filled with mincing favourites, the mignons, and Henri himself adored costume and caresses. His death by a fanatical monk's dagger was overshadowed by decades of satire portraying him as soft, oversexed, too in love with his courtiers. The irony was cruel. A warrior king by birth, remembered as a love-struck figure, mocked for sensuality instead of sovereignty. Closer to the Renaissance you find Queen Marguerite of Burgundy, married to Louis X of France. She died in 1315 in prison, suffocated by attendants after her affair was exposed. Chroniclers turned it into scandal. A queen, undone not by politics, but by passion. The humiliation was sharper because she had been confined in a dank castle tower, a far cry from gilded chambers. Her desire became her undoing. Scotland offers the tale of Lord Darnley, husband to Mary, Queen of Scots. Though not a king in his own right, he was consort, and his love affair with ambition destroyed him. In 1567 he was found dead in a garden, strangled, his house blown apart. His desperate clinging to Mary, coupled with jealousies and affairs, left him the subject of ridicule, a man who died less as royal spouse than as an inconvenient lover. Mary's own fate was tangled forever with that scandal. You pause in Rome, where Emperor Elagabalus fills the air with perfume. Barely 18 when assassinated in 222 CE, he had scandalised with his marriages, his lovers, his public offerings to gods of passion. Chroniclers claimed he died in women's clothing, dragged through the streets. Whether slander or not, the humiliation is remembered. An emperor whose thirst for love and display drowned his dignity. From Byzantium comes Constantine IX Monomachos, who filled his court with mistresses. When illness struck, he wasted away in their arms. Historians note the irony. A man mocked for indulgence, carried off by the weakness his indulgence worsened. You picture courtiers smirking behind pillars as the emperor whimpered to his beloveds instead of his generals. Another tale rises in Poland with Sigismund Augustus. Obsessed with Barbara Radziwiłł, he married her against opposition. She died young, likely of cancer, but gossip claimed poison, punishment for his blind love. Sigismund mourned theatrically, fainting, weeping at her tomb. Nobles mocked him as bewitched. His love story became a humiliation etched into politics, the king who could not rule his heart. You step east to Russia again, where Tsar Peter the First's half-brother Ivan Verfuzes was overshadowed by women in court. Rumours claimed he died collapsed after intimacy, a whisper courtiers repeated gleefully. Though probably apocryphal, the notion stuck. A Tsar remembered not for reign, but for a clumsy bedroom exit. Back to England, where George IV lived a life of humiliating passions. He secretly married Maria Fitzherbert before his official queen, and later pursued endless affairs. By the end, his obesity made him a caricature, a king wheezing in bed, unable to please lovers yet desperate for affection. He died in 1830 mocked not just for gluttony, but for having too much love and too little dignity. Even the mighty Julius Caesar carried whispers of bedroom humiliation. His enemies sneered that he was the husband of all wives and the wife of all husbands, accusing him of submission to King Nicomedes of Bithynia. When Caesar was assassinated, daggers carved his political life, but gossip ensured that his reputation was forever linked with bedroom rumour. The ultimate irony, a man who conquered Gaul but could not conquer mockery of his loves. In France again, Louis XV's affairs with a string of mistresses, culminating in Madame du Barry, became so notorious that when he died of smallpox in 1774, the court half cheered. His endless passion left him less a monarch than a figure of ridicule. Even as pustules covered his body, whispers recalled not his policies but his bed. Then there's the case of Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, whose dramatic death, suicide by snakebite in 30 BCE, was spun through the lens of her love affairs. To Romans, her passion for Julius Caesar and then Mark Antony made her appear as a queen who ruled with her body rather than her crown. The humiliation of her legacy lies not in failure alone, but in being remembered as a lover first, ruler second. And what of King Philip IV of France? He persecuted the Knights Templar, and when he died in 1314 after a hunting accident, rumours swirled that he had been cursed by Jacques de Molay. Yet some chroniclers also added salacious whispers that he was weakened by excess with mistresses. History remembers him more for scandal than triumph. You pause at another tragic figure, Queen Caroline Matilda of Denmark, caught in an affair with the reformist Struensee. In 1772 she was exiled and died 2 years later of scarlet fever, her dignity shredded by gossip that focused more on sheets than sovereignty. The humiliation clung, a queen remembered as adulteress more than reformer. From Persia comes Shah Abbas II again, not only undone by opium, but by endless liaisons that left him mocked for debauchery. Chroniclers painted him as a man whose deathbed groans were less about illness than excess. His dignity drowned under his own desire. Finally you step toward Mexico, where Emperor Maximilian, executed in 1867, was whispered to have been distracted by affairs and romantic escapism, mocked even as he faced the firing squad. His dreams of chivalric love seemed childish in the face of bullets. Through all these chambers the theme presses softly against you. Love is no shield, passion no crown. Kings and queens who gave in too fully found their deaths remembered not as majestic but as comic, tragic, humiliating. Desire turned royal chambers into gossip mills. You stand now in a room heavy with roses, the air perfumed and faint. The lesson drifts clear. Passion untempered leaves dignity behind. Monarchs died with whispers on their lips, remembered more for their lovers than their laws, and you, easing deeper into night, let that irony soothe you, because at least your own loves, embarrassing or tender, will not be embroidered into history's stage curtains. The night is nearly at its end, but before you drift into the calm of sleep, you find yourself walking into a hall where history chuckles. Here, kings and queens are remembered not with trumpets or dirges, but with smirks and giggles. These are the rulers whose deaths were so absurd, so drenched in folly, that they became legends of laughter. You step carefully, for even the marble floors seem to echo with stifled snickers, and every portrait along the walls wears a crooked smile. The first figure to stumble forward is Emperor Valentinian II, whom you've already seen dangling under suspicious circumstances in 392 CE. Though historians argue whether it was suicide or murder, the way the story was told in later years turned it into mockery. the emperor who thought himself divinely protected found hanged in his own palace. Romans laughed bitterly at the irony. The humiliation was not in the act itself, but in the narrative that stripped away dignity, leaving only an image of failure swinging in the candlelight. But even more famous in the realm of laughable exits is King Adolf Frederick of Sweden. His reign was uneventful, his policies forgettable, but his death in 1771 made him immortal. He ate himself into the grave. Lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, champagne, and 14 servings of semla buns swimming in milk. The king who ate himself to death is how every Swede remembers him. Imagine the court servants rolling their eyes as he demanded another bun, another bowl of hot milk. His breath slowed, his chest heaved, and finally the monarch slumped over the table, victim of gluttony. Historians nod politely about indigestion and stroke, but people still laugh. His epitaph became dessert. In France, King Louis III met his end in 882 while pursuing a woman. He spurred his horse so wildly in chase that he struck his head on a doorframe and died instantly. Chroniclers almost sound gleeful in their descriptions. A king undone not in battle, but by lust and low architecture. The embarrassment is easy to picture. The mighty monarch sprawled in the dirt, his courtiers unable to explain to the people that their king had simply died of chasing skirts too enthusiastically. Rome offers another gem in Emperor Caracalla, murdered in 217 CE while relieving himself by the roadside. He had stopped his retinue to urinate when a soldier struck him down. A man who had proclaimed himself a god, caught with trousers undone, reduced to the punchline of latrine humour. Historians still debate whether the killer was a lone conspirator or part of a larger plot, but the humiliation needed no debate. To this day, Caracalla is remembered as much for bathroom jokes as for his edicts. You glance toward England now, where King Edmund Ironside collapsed in 1016 in what must be one of the most mortifying ways ever recorded. After straining himself during, well, let's call it an overly vigorous toilet session, he suffered either a sudden illness or, as legend had it, an assassin hidden beneath the privy stabbing him from below. Whether disease or dagger, the imagery was too embarrassing to forget. The king who had fought valiantly against Canute's invasion was reduced in memory to the one who died on the privy. In Greece, Philip II, father of Alexander, also bore whispers of humiliation. Though his actual assassination was political, legends embroidered his end with animal omens and clumsy wounds. In one tale, he entered the theatre to be crowned, tripped on the threshold, and was mocked by crowds for bad luck, only to be assassinated moments later. The stumble became part of his myth, a clumsy overture to tragedy. A more theatrical laugh belongs to Sigurd the Mighty of Orkney, that Viking who strapped a severed head to his saddle. The dead man's teeth scratched his leg, infection set in, and the great warrior was slain by dental revenge. Saga writers delighted in retelling the absurdity. Imagine tough men around a fire chuckling over their cups. Sigurd, undone by a molar. His death became less a warning about war and more a parable of cosmic slapstick. From Byzantium, Emperor Michael II the Amorian provides another humiliating note. Known as the Stammerer, he died in 829 of epilepsy, collapsing mid-ceremony. Chroniclers described him flailing before a crowd, robes twisting around him, courtiers whispering and stifling laughter even as they pretended to mourn. For a man mocked in life for halting speech, to die in a convulsion before his audience sealed the humiliation, Scotland adds James Th's father, James IV, who perished heroically at Flodden in 1513. But James V himself died of despair after Solway Moss in 1542. The joke whispered in taverns was that he had been defeated less by battle than by melancholy. A king who sulked himself to death became an object of ridicule. His dramatic sighs and refusals of food turned into parody long after. You stop at Rome again for Emperor Galba, assassinated in 69 CE. Dragged into the streets, he cried, "What about my years of service?" as soldiers cut him down. Chroniclers mocked the pitiful plea, a man trying to argue his resume at the edge of a sword. Instead of dying with stoic silence, he begged. Theatrics of desperation stained his memory. Farther east you find Persian rulers who overdosed on perfumes and aphrodisiacs. One tale tells of a Shah who smeared himself in musk and oils so heavily that he fainted, smothered by his own vanity. He lingered long enough for rivals to laugh that he had drowned in fragrance. And then you return to perhaps the most enduring legend of laughter, Catherine the Great of Russia. Her actual death in 1796 was from a stroke in her chamber, but enemies spread the rumour that she died attempting intimacy with a horse. Absurd, cruel, slanderous, and yet the tale persists centuries later, overshadowing her reforms, her empire, her legacy. The humiliation here is not in truth but in rumour, in how easily laughter can drown dignity. Spain offers Charles II once more. His twisted body, his childlessness, his endless ailments made him seem cursed. When he died, people whispered he had been a puppet of demons, his life a farce from start to finish. Embarrassment eclipsed power, a king remembered as a caricature, more clown than monarch. And don't forget Martin of Aragon, who died of indigestion while laughing at a joke. That image, royal belly-shaking, goose still digesting, laughter turning to death rattle, has outlived every law he passed. Finally you pass to Sweden again, where Gustavus Adolphus's successors joked about their ancestor dying in fog, riding into the mist like a stage actor missing his mark. Folly carried on as family tradition. Through all these tales you realise laughter is history's sharpest pen. A king may win battles, pass laws, raise cities, but if he dies stupidly, that becomes his epitaph. Laughter lasts longer than decrees. The humiliation of monarchs becomes the bedtime amusement of common folk centuries later. And yet, as you step softly from this hall of ridicule, the laughter grows quieter, turning into a lull. Because perhaps the greatest lesson is that everyone is laughable in the end. The difference is that kings had scribes to record their bloopers. You have only memory, which is far kinder. You close your eyes and let the chuckles fade into whispers. The hall dims, the portraits lose their crooked smiles, and the legends of folly dissolve into soft darkness. And now, dear night wanderer, we've walked through 18 long corridors of royal humiliation. Banquets gone wrong, bathhouse slips, cursed kings, drunken collapses, animal bites, and deaths so ironic they could have been scripted by fate itself. The torches gutter low, and you feel the hush settling over these empty halls. The laughter, sharp and mocking at first, softens now, thinning into a sigh. Take a breath. The great spectacle is over. The kings and queens, with all their crowns, jewels and pomp, are gone, faded into stories that keep their embarrassments alive only so we can smile gently at them centuries later. Their dignity cracked open, yes, but their humanity shines more clearly because of it. Let the imagery dissolve slowly. The clatter of goblets, the snap of banners in the wind, the steam of bathhouses, the faint ripple of lakes. All of it softens into a blur, as though you're watching the surface of water calm after a stone has been dropped. You realise that even in folly there is comfort, because these rulers, for all their grandeur, were undone by the same slips and stumbles that catch us all. Your own mistakes, your own awkwardness, your own small embarrassments. They fade quickly, forgotten by others, never etched in chronicles or tapestries. The monarchs bore the heavy weight of history's gaze. You, mercifully, do not. So let your shoulders relax. Let your breath lengthen. Imagine the crowns and sceptres being set down, the lights dimming, the curtains falling on the great theatre of the past. In the quiet hum of your own room, there is only safety, softness, and the steady rhythm of rest. History chuckles one last time, not cruelly now, but kindly, before retreating into silence. Sleep follows, gentle and forgiving.